Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It all started with a simple question. What if time was never the same again? I had never been one for relics or antiques, but there was something about that old pocket watch that caught my eye. It sat in a dusty corner of the antique shop, half hidden behind a stack of faded books, as though it had been waiting for me. Its silver surface gleamed faintly in the dim light, calling to me in a way that I couldn't explain. The shopkeeper, an elderly man with thick glasses, noticed my curiosity. He shuffled over and, with a knowing look, placed the watch in my hands. It felt heavier than I expected. Cold. Solid. "This one's special," he said, his voice low. "It's been here for decades, never worked, but it's never left either." I turned the watch over in my hands, inspecting the craftsmanship. The front was engraved with intricate patterns, but it was the face that intrigued me most. The hands of the clock were frozen at exactly 3 o'clock. It wasn't that the watch had stopped, no, it had never moved. The hands were solidly locked in place, as though they belonged to a moment long past. "Why doesn't it work?" I asked. The shopkeeper shrugged. "Time does strange things with some objects. This one, well, it does more than just tell the time." I should have walked away then. But I didn't. There was something magnetic about it. Something that made me want to understand its mystery. I handed over the money, and with a final nod from the shopkeeper, I left the store with the pocket watch in my coat pocket, unaware that it would soon unravel my world in ways I couldn't yet imagine. The following days were uneventful, but every time I glanced at the pocket watch, the hands remained fixed at 3 o'clock. I grew accustomed to its quiet presence, a strange companion that seemed to offer no more than its silence. Then, one evening, as I sat at my kitchen table, I noticed something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was subtle at first, just a small shift in the atmosphere. The room felt slightly colder, though nothing had changed. I glanced at the pocket watch again. 3 o'clock. Still unmoving. But then I heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a soft rustle of paper or the whisper of footsteps too quiet to fully recognize. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't my imagination. No, it was something else. Something closer. I looked around. Nothing. Just the silence of my empty apartment. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine, but the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. Almost like it was coming from behind me. I stood up, heart racing, and turned toward the doorway. There was nothing there. Yet, I felt it. The presence of something just out of sight. Then I looked down at the pocket watch again. 3 o'clock. The time was frozen, but everything around me was changing. Slowly, subtly, until it felt as though reality itself was beginning to stretch and warp around the stillness of those hands. The next few days were marked by this growing unease. The noises continued. A scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the floor, followed by a pause, as if waiting for me to react. The air grew thick, the space around me tightening with each moment. I started to feel trapped, as if the walls were closing in, though nothing in the room had physically changed. But the worst part? It was the way the pocket watch seemed to react to it all. Each time I looked at it, the time remained frozen. But with each passing day, the strange occurrences grew stronger, more distinct. The whispers turned into footsteps, moving closer each time I glanced away. The shadows in the corners of my vision began to stretch, becoming shapes darker and more defined. And yet, it was the stillness of the watch that haunted me the most. How could something so simple hold so much power? What was it about the time at 3 o'clock that allowed it to control the world around me? I couldn't stop myself from looking at it. Each glance made the tension grow. Every moment I spent with it felt like I was teetering on the edge of something far worse than I could comprehend. I needed answers, but I also feared what I might uncover. I was beginning to understand now. The watch wasn't just an object. It was a key to something else. Something else that bent time itself. The nights grew longer, and so did my unease. It wasn't just the sounds anymore. It was the way things around me seemed to change when I wasn't paying attention. I would leave a room only to return and find something out of place, a book turned upside down, a chair slightly shifted from where it had been. Little things, at first. But they began to pile up, each one like a subtle push that nudged me further into a place where reality didn't quite feel right. And the watch was always there. I couldn't help it. I found myself checking it every few minutes, each glance punctuated by the eerie certainty that I was being watched. 3 o'clock. The frozen hands never moved. I began to wonder if it was somehow connected to the things that were happening around me. As if, every time I looked at it, the world around me shifted in response. But what was the watch trying to tell me? One night, as I sat at my desk, scribbling down notes in an attempt to make sense of everything, I heard the noise again. This time it was louder, clearer, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as though someone was pacing just outside my door. My heart thudded in my chest as I froze, unable to move. I knew no one was there, not physically. The apartment was empty, but the footsteps? They didn't belong to anyone I could see. I turned to the watch. 3 o'clock. Still. And then it happened. For the first time since I'd found it, I felt a shift in the air, like something invisible had just moved, displaced. The walls seemed to bend slightly, as if they were being pulled on by some invisible force. The temperature dropped, and a chill ran down my spine. I reached out, grabbing the watch with trembling fingers, my breath shallow as I felt a sudden wave of dizziness wash over me. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, everything was quiet. A silence so thick it felt oppressive. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow. No, not a shadow. A figure. It stood there, at the edge of my vision, where the light didn't quite reach. A tall, dark shape, its outline blurred as though it was caught between two realities. It didn't move, not at first, just stood there, staring, waiting. I swallowed hard, too terrified to move, my hands still clutching the cold metal of the pocket watch. My mind screamed at me to run, to get away, but my feet were glued to the floor. The figure didn't make a sound. It simply waited. And then I realized something. The watch had stopped, yes, but the world around me was still moving, changing. I wasn't just seeing things, they were real. This thing, this presence, was real. The figure slowly began to move, its form growing clearer with each step it took toward me. The more it came into focus, the more I could feel the temperature drop, the air becoming thick and heavy, as if it was pressing in from all sides. It moved with a strange fluidity, like it wasn't entirely bound to the physical laws I knew. Each movement it made seemed to distort the room, the edges of the walls bending as if they couldn't contain it. I could barely breathe. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. My mind screamed at me to look away, to shut my eyes, to block it out. But I couldn't. I was locked in place, my eyes fixed on the shadow as it stood at the threshold of the room, just barely visible. And then, in a voice that was both distant and impossibly close, it spoke. "It's time." The words, if you could call them that, were no more than a whisper, but they reverberated inside my head, loud and clear. "It's time." And then, without any warning, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, leaving nothing behind but an oppressive silence and the cold, lingering presence of something that should not have existed. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The watch was still in my hand, its hands unwavering at 3 o'clock, and I could feel the weight of it as though it were somehow heavier than before. I didn't understand. What had just happened? Was that a dream? Or had I actually seen something? Felt something? The room was still cold, the air still thick, and the silence was deafening. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker, as if the figure had left behind a trace of itself. I didn't know what to do, where to go, or what was real anymore. But I knew one thing for certain, whatever that thing was, whatever was tied to the watch, it wasn't done with me. And if I wasn't careful, it never would be. I placed the pocket watch down on the desk, unable to take my eyes off it. What was its purpose? Why was it doing this to me? And most importantly, what was coming next? I didn't have the answers yet. But the longer I kept it close, the more I began to realize that I was tied to it, tied to something, and no matter how far I tried to run, it would follow me. It had already started. The clock had stopped, but time was still moving. The days that followed were a blur. I could no longer trust the world around me, nor could I trust myself. I began to avoid looking at the watch, terrified of what would happen if I did. But the urge, the pull, was always there, silent, insistent. Each time I saw it sitting there, perfectly still, I knew something would change if I dared to glance at it again. Yet, I couldn't help myself. 3 o'clock. No matter how many times I told myself to resist, to leave it untouched, I always found myself drawn back to it. It was as if the watch had become an anchor in a world that no longer made sense. And every time I stared at it, every time I focused on its still hands, something shifted, just slightly, around me. A flicker in the corner of my eye, a creak in the floorboards, a whisper of movement in the air. But it wasn't just the watch that had changed. I had, too. I hadn't slept properly in days. The weight of the events, the figure, the whispers, the unnatural stillness of the clock was wearing on me. I began to lose track of time. My days blurred into one another, each moment indistinguishable from the next. I had no routine anymore, no sense of normalcy. The boundaries between waking and sleeping were beginning to dissolve, and I felt as if I were caught in some kind of endless loop, tethered to the watch in a way I didn't understand. And then, it happened again. I was sitting at my desk late one evening, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, unable to focus. The sounds had returned, louder this time, more persistent. Footsteps. Not from outside the door, but from within the walls themselves. A low thudding, as if something heavy was moving just behind the plaster. My skin crawled as the noise grew, each footfall echoing with unnatural precision. I stood up, heart racing, the hairs on my neck standing on end. I couldn't move, not because I was frozen with fear, but because something inside me, something dark and primal, was pulling me toward the source of the sound, toward the watch. It was 3 o'clock again, but this time I noticed something different. The hands weren't exactly still anymore. They were trembling, shaking as if struggling against some invisible force. My hand reached out, almost of its own accord, to stop them, to make it stop, but the moment my fingers brushed the metal, the world around me shattered. The room seemed to collapse inward, as though the walls were crumbling into dust. I felt the floor beneath me shift, the ground trembling as if an earthquake was tearing the very foundation of the building apart. I gasped, clutching the watch in my hand as I was pulled into a sudden, disorienting vertigo. The noise, the footsteps, were deafening now, a cacophony of movement that swirled around me, spinning the room in a dizzying spiral. And then the walls breathed. They expanded and contracted, as if alive, pulsing with some unnatural rhythm. And that was when I saw it again. The figure. It stood in the center of the room, only this time it was different. Its shape was more defined, more solid. I could see the contours of its face, a twisted mask of shadow and despair. It had no eyes, no features, only darkness where a face should have been. Yet, I could feel its gaze, pressing into me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "You are not meant to leave," it said. The voice was like 1,000 whispers, layered on top of each other, each one scraping at my mind, driving me closer to the edge. I dropped to my knees, the weight of its presence nearly suffocating me. The room was spinning faster now, the walls bending at impossible angles, the air thick with a pressure I could barely breathe through. The figure took a step toward me, its form shifting with the movement of the space itself. The space between us closed in an instant, and I felt the full force of its presence bearing down on me. "You are bound to it now. There is no escape." The words pierced me, cutting through my thoughts, through my very soul. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my body refused to obey. The watch, it had become a part of me now. A tether. A chain. I could feel its influence wrapping around me like iron, pulling me deeper into whatever this nightmare was. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't move. The figure loomed over me, its hand reaching out as if to claim me. The world around us warped, folding upon itself, and I felt a tug, no, a pull, like I was being dragged through time itself, ripped away from my own reality and thrust into something darker, more ancient. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. Silence. The room was still. The figure was gone. The air had returned to its normal state, and the trembling in the watch's hands had ceased. I sat there, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. My body shook, drenched in cold sweat, as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. It was over. But was it? The watch remained in my hand, its face still frozen at 3 o'clock. I didn't know how long I sat there, but it didn't matter. The truth had settled in my mind like a heavy weight. Whatever was happening wasn't over. The watch, the time, it wasn't done with me. It had only just begun. I could feel it now. A constant, subtle hum, as though the watch was alive, breathing with a pulse that mirrored my own. Something deep inside me was beginning to unravel, to stretch, and I knew that I was being pulled deeper into whatever dark force held sway over that cursed pocket watch. The rules had changed. The clock had stopped. But time was no longer the same. And now, neither was I. I couldn't escape it. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I wanted to turn my back on the watch, it was always there. The very air around me seemed to hum with its presence. Every glance, every brief look at its frozen hands, drew me deeper into its web. The world around me felt thinner, as if I were standing on the edge of something far worse than a nightmare, something that could tear apart reality itself. I didn't leave my apartment for days. There was no point. The streets had started to feel wrong, as though the world outside had begun to bend and break, too. I could hear whispers in the corners of my mind, soft but insistent, urging me to look at the watch again, to see what it had in store for me next. But what could I do? I was trapped. The walls felt as though they were closing in, the ceiling low, and the floor unsteady beneath my feet. I could hear the same strange sounds, footsteps, shifting shadows, whispers in the walls. It was as if the apartment had become alive, or perhaps it was I who had become part of it. The presence wasn't leaving me. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think straight. The days blended together in a haze of exhaustion, each one more suffocating than the last. I would wake up with a start, gasping for breath, as though I had been trapped underwater, and every time I would look at the clock. 3 o'clock. Still. Frozen. It was as if time itself had broken, its rhythm twisted and warped, leaving me in a constant loop of confusion. And then, one night, the air grew thick. Thicker than before. It felt like a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it harder to breathe. I could feel something moving in the dark corners of the room, something other than the shadows. I had to look. I didn't want to, but I couldn't stop myself. The watch was there, resting on the table where I had left it. The hands, frozen, still at 3 o'clock. But they trembled now. They moved ever so slightly, a fraction, as if something inside the watch was waking up. The room shifted again. The walls seemed to stretch, expanding and contracting like a living thing, the corners bending and twisting in unnatural ways. The floor groaned underfoot, as though something beneath it was stirring. The temperature plummeted, and the oppressive silence was broken only by the faintest sound of something scraping, dragging, just beyond the threshold of my awareness. I turned slowly, my heart racing, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The darkness in the corner of the room deepened, thickening, forming into something. A shape. It was back. The figure. The same one, yet somehow different. This time, it wasn't just standing still. It was moving, shifting, coming closer. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. It was as if the very air had become thick with something I couldn't move through. The room seemed to stretch and warp, the floor beneath me distorting, and the walls narrowing until I couldn't tell where I was anymore. The figure loomed closer, its form blurring, its presence overpowering, an overwhelming force that consumed everything in its path. Its voice was nothing but a whisper at first, but it grew louder until it was all I could hear. "It's time for you to join us," it said, its words like 1,000 needles digging into my skin. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back, but I couldn't. My throat was constricted, my body frozen in place, paralyzed by the very presence of it. The figure reached out a hand, or something like a hand, long, dark, and shifting in the dim light. It hovered in the air, inches from my face, and I could feel the cold radiating off it. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I might pass out. But before I could, something inside me snapped. The watch. I hadn't dropped it. It was still in my hand. Cold. heavy. I don't know why, but I raised it, holding it in front of me like a shield. The figure's hand froze midair, as if something was blocking it. The air around me vibrated with an unnatural hum, and the shadows in the room shifted, recoiling as though they were being repelled by the watch. The figure stepped back, its form flickering and distorting. "No," it whispered, a sound full of frustration, anger. "You cannot defy it." But it was too late. The watch glowed faintly, its face suddenly alive, the hands beginning to tick, inching toward the next second. The walls around me shifted again, but this time they were breaking apart, as if something was tearing through the fabric of reality itself. The figure, whatever it was, shuddered, its form disintegrating, fading into the air like mist. I didn't know how long I stood there, staring at the watch, the room still as quiet as death itself. The figure was gone. The room was intact. The sounds, the footsteps, the shadows, everything was still. But something had changed. The air was still thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. The watch wasn't done yet. I could feel it. The pulse beneath my skin, the thrum of something dark and ancient, something that didn't belong here. I wanted to run, to leave it all behind. But I knew I couldn't. The watch wasn't just a timepiece. It was a door, a window into something else, something far beyond what I could ever understand. And I was its keeper now, bound to it, tied to its strange and terrifying power. And no matter how far I ran, I would never escape it. I looked down at the pocket watch in my hand. The time was frozen once again. 3 o'clock. But the world? The world was no longer the same. Time itself was broken, and the cracks were starting to show. I knew then that there was no escape. The moment I touched the watch, the moment I became part of its world, everything shifted. Time, reality, they were no longer things I could understand or control. I could feel the cracks in the world deepening with every breath I took. The lines between what was real and what was not began to blur, and every day that passed, the world felt more and more like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. It wasn't just a figure anymore. It was everything, the sounds, the shadows, the way the air pressed down on me like it was alive. The walls, once so solid, now seemed to pulse, shifting, breathing, as though they were in sync with whatever lay beyond them. I could feel something watching me, waiting for me to slip, to make a mistake, to step into whatever dark space the watch had opened up. And I was slipping. I started to notice things that didn't make sense. Familiar objects, my phone, my books, the picture frames, would shift. One moment they'd be where I left them, and the next, they'd be in different spots, just enough to unsettle me. I would wake up in the morning, certain that I had been asleep for hours, only to find that it had been mere minutes since I closed my eyes. Time had stopped. Or perhaps it had never been real to begin with. The worst part, though, was the feeling of being watched, of being known. I couldn't escape the sense that something, someone, was always there, lingering just out of sight. The figure had made it clear that I couldn't escape it, but now I wondered if it was even the worst of the things that I had to face. The watch had changed me. I felt it. I could no longer trust myself, no longer trust my senses. The world around me felt like an illusion, a fragile construct held together by some invisible thread that could snap at any moment. And the worst part? I was becoming part of it. I could feel the pull of something darker, something older, reaching for me, slowly wrapping itself around my thoughts, my heart. I had to do something. One night, in the dead of what should have been sleep, I did what I had been avoiding for so long. I picked up the watch again. I couldn't leave it. I couldn't tear myself away. Something told me it was time to face whatever waited behind this stillness, whatever this thing had planned for me. The moment I touched it, the world tilted. The room around me didn't just shift, it fractured. The walls crumbled like paper, folding into themselves as the space between the present and the unknown widened. I felt my body pull through a gap, a tearing sensation that made me want to scream, but no sound came. I wasn't alone. I felt it. The figure, it was there, its presence pressing down on me, surrounding me with its cold, implacable energy. And then, I saw it. The world beyond the watch. It wasn't a place. It wasn't even a reality. It was nothing. Just an expanse of darkness, stretched infinitely, with no up, no down, no direction at all. There were no walls, no ground beneath my feet, just a void that seemed to pull at my very soul, threatening to swallow me whole. I could feel myself drifting, falling, being pulled through time and space itself, lost in an endless loop where the concept of time didn't exist. The figure appeared in the void, its form sharper now, clearer, more tangible. It stood in front of me, its faceless eyes locked onto mine. There was no way to escape it, no way to hide from it. And yet, somehow, I wasn't afraid, not in the way I expected to be. Fear wasn't the right word. It was more like a resigned understanding. The figure's voice came, not as words, but as an undeniable truth that echoed deep within me. You cannot leave this place. You are tied to it now. The words filled me, settled inside my chest like a weight I couldn't shake. It wasn't just a watch anymore. It was me. I was part of it. I was a thread in this web, a part of the darkness that stretched endlessly ahead. And I realized that the world I had known, the people, the places, the time I had lived through, had all been an illusion. This void was all that was real. This was where I belonged now. But then, just as the realization sunk in, something else shifted. The watch, the constant in my hand, changed. The hands, once frozen, began to move again. Slowly. Reluctantly. But they moved. 3 o'clock. And then the world around me began to collapse, like sand through my fingers. The void around me fractured, cracking open as though the fabric of everything was being torn apart. The figure screamed, a soundless, impossible wail, as its form began to disintegrate. But it wasn't alone. The very nature of the place was unraveling. Everything I had once known was slipping away. I felt myself pulled, torn, back toward the light, back toward the room I had left behind. The cracks in the void sealed themselves as I was hurled forward, my body re-entering the space I had once thought was reality. And then, with a final, disorienting twist, I was back. The apartment. The room. Everything was the same. But it wasn't. I could feel the change in the air. The silence was different now. Heavy. Saturated with a knowledge I could never unlearn. I looked at the watch, still clutched in my hand. 3 o'clock. It hadn't stopped. It hadn't moved, not in the way I thought it had. It had always been moving. Always. And it had taken me with it. I was no longer in control of time. Time controlled me. It always had. And no matter how far I tried to run, no matter where I went, I would never escape it. I had stepped into the endless hour, and the hour would never end. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to know your own future? To see the events of your day unfold before they even happen? But what if that knowledge wasn't something you wanted to see? What if it was a warning? And what if that warning was about your own death? It began simply enough. At first, I thought nothing of it. A letter arrived each day, no return address, no name on the envelope. I never thought to question it. My routine was simple: work, eat, sleep, and then, before bed, I'd open the letter. It was always the same: no signature, no marks of any kind, just neatly typed words on a blank page. At first, the letters contained small details, things I hadn't noticed. That day, I had walked past a bakery, and it described the scent of fresh bread in the air. Another day, it mentioned the yellow jacket I had worn on a chilly morning walk through the park. They were mundane, harmless notes, just observations of my day. I was intrigued at first, but they didn't feel dangerous. Then, the descriptions started to change. The things mentioned weren't just small details about my life, they were things I couldn't explain. The letter would say things like, "You felt a sudden chill at the bus stop today, though the temperature hadn't dropped yet," or, "When you turned the corner by the library, you saw someone standing in the shadow of the tree, though no one was supposed to be there." I began to feel uneasy, but I brushed it off as coincidence. Maybe someone was just watching me, paying attention to my movements. But then came the first ominous letter. I had been driving home from work when a red car had followed me for several blocks. It wasn't until I reached my driveway that it turned down another street, but the letter the next morning described the exact moment I saw the red car in my rearview mirror. It described my racing heart, the unease in my stomach, even the brief moment I thought about speeding up to lose it. How could anyone have known that? I thought it was a joke. Perhaps a friend was playing tricks on me. But then the letters became more specific, more accurate. The following week, I dropped my coffee cup while walking into the office. The letter the next day described the incident in vivid detail, right down to the dark brown stain on my shirt. My heart raced with fear. How could they know this? Who was sending them? As time passed, the letters didn't just describe my day anymore, they began to predict it. A letter would arrive the morning before a specific event, detailing exactly what would happen, right down to the smallest detail. I started to feel trapped. Each letter seemed to be a step ahead of me, like someone was guiding my every move. And it was no longer benign. It wasn't just noting my actions, it was anticipating them, almost as if the sender was making them happen. But who? I tried to stop reading them. I threw a few away, but each time I did, another one would appear, just as accurate as the last. I started to change my routine, take different routes, skip work altogether, but it didn't matter. The letters always seemed to find me. Then, one day, the letter was different. It didn't just predict the ordinary events of my day, it described something more disturbing. At approximately 7:30 in the evening, the letter read, "You will be sitting on your couch, watching television. You will hear a faint scratching noise from the closet. You will get up, thinking it's just the wind. But when you open the door, you will find nothing. The door will close by itself. But it won't be the wind that's responsible. Someone will be standing behind you. And when you turn, it will be too late." I froze. The letter didn't just describe my day, it described something far worse. Something I couldn't dismiss. My breath caught in my throat, my eyes scanning the room around me. But everything seemed normal. The letter wasn't a joke. It wasn't some strange coincidence. Someone somehow, knew exactly what was going to happen. But how? And why me? The fear I felt that night wasn't just the fear of a simple prediction, it was the fear of knowing what was coming. I couldn't escape it. And as each day passed, each letter grew more foreboding, more precise. The words on the page had become my own personal prophecy. But it was the last letter that terrified me the most. It was the one I had been dreading since the moment this began. The one I knew was coming, but didn't want to face. It was as if the sender had known my thoughts, my deepest fears. The letter read, "Tomorrow, at precisely 6:29 p.m., you will stand by your kitchen window, looking out into the street. You will hear footsteps approaching from behind. You will feel a cold breath on your neck, and when you turn around, you will see no one. The footsteps will stop. The silence will stretch, suffocating you. You will be alone. You will never make it out alive. The end will come swiftly. You will be gone." I don't know why, but I couldn't tear myself away from it. I read it over and over again, hoping for some way out, some twist, some hidden meaning. But no matter how many times I read it, the words never changed. Tomorrow, at 6:29 p.m., I would die. And it wasn't just a prediction anymore. It felt like a certainty, like I was trapped in a story that had already been written, and my death was the inevitable conclusion. I couldn't bring myself to discard the last letter, no matter how much I wanted to. Instead, I held it in my shaking hands, feeling the weight of it as though it were a physical burden. Tomorrow, 6:29 p.m. It felt as if the hours were stretching out, like the clock itself was mocking me with each second that passed. I told myself I would do something about it. I couldn't just sit idly by and let this happen. But how could I fight against something I couldn't even comprehend? Someone knew my every movement, my every thought. They knew me better than I knew myself. I spent the rest of the day trying to make sense of it, trying to find a reason, a way to escape. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone's been sending me letters about my life and my death. They would think I was crazy, and even if I managed to get their attention, would they really believe me? Would they be able to stop something that was already inevitable? The day dragged on, each hour passing like a weight pressing down on my chest. As the clock ticked closer to 6, my thoughts became more frantic. What should I do? Should I leave the house, get in my car, drive far away? But where could I go? Would I be safe anywhere? Or was this just the beginning of some twisted game that had no end? At 5:55, I stood by the window. The letter had said I would be by the kitchen window at 6:29, looking out into the street. And now, here I was, waiting for something, anything, that might give me a clue. The streets outside were quiet, the usual hum of the city muffled by the oppressive silence that had settled over me. I felt it in the air, thick and heavy, pressing against my skin, as if the world itself was holding its breath. 5 minutes. It was just 5 minutes away. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't ready for this. I wasn't ready to face whatever waited for me. I tried to think of something, anything, that might break this cycle, but the fear was suffocating, drowning out every other thought. At 6:25, I heard it. A soft scratching sound. Faint, at first, like the rustling of paper or the shifting of something in the distance. It came from behind me, from the dark hallway that led to my bedroom. I froze. The letter had said it would happen. It had said this moment would come. I turned slowly, my body stiff with fear, and I saw nothing. Just the empty hallway stretching before me, the shadows lingering in the corners like dark hands waiting to grab me. I turned back to the window, trying to steady my breath, but the scratching sound grew louder, closer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't just my imagination. There was something there, something real, something that shouldn't be. I walked slowly towards the hallway, my feet making no sound against the floor. Every step felt like a leap into the unknown, each one bringing me closer to whatever horror the letter had foretold. My hand reached for the door, and just as I touched the handle, it stopped. The silence was deafening. The scratching had ceased, leaving only the weight of my own breath. I hesitated, my fingers still on the door, unsure of whether to open it or run. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. They were coming from behind me. I didn't need to look to know. I could feel them, the presence creeping up on me, filling the space with an oppressive energy. The letter had been right. I could feel it in my bones. Something was behind me. Something that had always been there, waiting. I turned, my heart in my throat. But there was nothing. Nothing but the shadows and the stillness. I was alone. Or was I? I stepped back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. But I couldn't. It was as if the world had shifted, like everything I had known had been upended in that moment. The footsteps were gone, but the feeling, no, the presence, remained. I could feel it, pressing in on me, suffocating me, reminding me that I was not in control. The clock ticked louder in my ears, its hands creeping closer to 6:29. I didn't know what to do anymore. The letter had been clear. The footsteps had been real. There was no escaping it. The end was coming. The door was still in front of me, and I knew that when I opened it, nothing would be the same. But I had no choice. I reached for the handle, and then the lights flickered. For a brief, terrifying moment, everything went dark. The shadows that had once been just shapes in the corners of my vision now pressed in on me, heavy and oppressive. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and a coldness settled over me, wrapping around me like a blanket of dread. The air grew thick, suffocating, and I could hear my own breath, ragged and uneven, echoing in my ears. The clock was still ticking. 6:28. The scratching sound began again, louder this time. It was coming from inside the closet now. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The world felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in, the darkness swallowing the light. There was something in that closet. Something waiting for me. 6:29. And then, the door slammed open. The room was still. The silence was deafening. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, unable to escape the weight of the moment. I knew what would come next. It was inevitable. I turned slowly. And there, in the doorway, was the shadow. A figure. Tall. Elusive. Its form flickered like smoke, ever shifting, never fully solid. But its eyes, those eyes, they were unmistakable. They were watching me, cold and empty, filled with an ancient, unknowable hunger. I didn't scream. There was no need. Because in that moment, I realized the truth. The letters hadn't just predicted my death. They had caused it. And the shadow was the one who had written them. The figure in the doorway didn't move. It stood there, as though waiting for me to make the first move. Its form flickered in and out of focus, like a television on the verge of static, never quite materializing, yet never truly disappearing. And in those moments, my thoughts were a blur of panic, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of inevitability. I couldn't scream. My throat was tight, suffocated by the weight of what I had just realized. The letters, the steps, the predictions, none of it had been random. This wasn't a coincidence. This was part of something larger, something older than me, something that had planned this moment long before I had ever received the first letter. I backed up slowly, my legs shaky, as if each step took me farther from the reality I had known. But the air around me was thick, charged with a strange energy, and no matter how far I stepped back, I couldn't escape the sensation that the figure was right behind me, its presence filling the room. It spoke. The voice that emerged was not a voice I recognized. It wasn't human, yet it had the echo of something long lost, something ancient. It was a whisper at first, a sound like rustling leaves in the wind, yet it held a weight to it that made my heart skip a beat. "You've been waiting," it said, its voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Waiting for an end you could never avoid." I wanted to speak, to ask questions, to plead for my life. But my body wouldn't obey me. The words wouldn't form. Instead, I was trapped in the pull of its gaze, those eyes, empty and cold, yet filled with a knowing that sent a chill deep into my bones. The letters. The warnings. They had all led to this moment. "You thought you could escape," the figure continued, its form flickering like an old photograph in a fire. "But you're already part of the story, just as everyone else before you." The weight of those words pressed down on me, each one more suffocating than the last. How could this be? How could I be trapped in a story that wasn't even mine? Then, with a sudden motion, it stepped forward, the room shifting with it. I could no longer distinguish the space I was in. It felt as though the walls were closing in, warping into an unfamiliar shape, and the floor beneath me seemed to tilt and sway. The shadows from the corners of the room crept towards me, filling the space with a darkness that wasn't natural. "You are already dead," the figure whispered again, its voice echoing in the darkness. "But this is how it always ends. The final letter. The final warning. And then, nothing." My heart hammered in my chest, each beat seeming louder than the last. I wanted to run, to escape, but there was no escape. The very air around me seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of fate. My eyes darted around the room, but there was no way out. The windows were covered in darkness. The door had vanished, as if the world itself had collapsed in on itself. The figure moved again, gliding closer with unnatural speed. It wasn't walking, no, it was floating, its form shifting and writhing like smoke, moving faster than I could comprehend. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end to come. And then, there was a crack. A snap in the air like a breaking thread, and I opened my eyes again. I was back at my desk. The letter had arrived. The room around me was unchanged. I felt my pulse slow, the panic subsiding for a moment, as though the previous moments had been some fevered nightmare. My hands were trembling as I reached for the envelope, my mind still reeling, my thoughts disjointed. But when I opened it, the words inside were clear. Too clear. "Tomorrow, you will sit at your desk, holding this very letter. The time will be 6:29 p.m. The last breath you take will be the one that seals your fate. You will never escape." The words on the page seemed to burn into my mind, vivid and undeniable. There was no way out. There was no turning back. The figure, the shadow, the warning, everything was coming to fruition. The end was already written. I slammed the letter down onto the desk, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The room felt smaller now, closing in on me. The clock ticked loudly in the background, the seconds stretching between each beat like an eternity. I couldn't think clearly. I was suffocating. I stood up abruptly, knocking the chair backward, and rushed to the window. I needed to get out. I needed to escape this. But the street outside was eerily empty, and the sky above me was thick with clouds, the light dimming as if the world itself was preparing for something terrible. 6:28. I turned to the door, my mind racing. The figure was out there somewhere, just waiting, watching. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't fight it. The letter had been right all along. It had always been right. I heard it then. The scratching sound. Soft, insistent. Like a nail dragging across the floor. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Instead, I pressed my hand against the door, feeling the coldness of the wood beneath my palm. 6:29. It was time. The door creaked open slowly, and I took one last breath before I stepped into the darkness. The silence was deafening. And then, I was gone. The last letter had been delivered. And the story, for me, had ended. But for someone else, it was just beginning. I don't know how much time passed before I realized that I was no longer in control of anything. The shadows had swallowed me whole, and I was adrift in a world that felt both foreign and familiar, like a nightmare in which everything was distorted but held the cruel thread of reality. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the room anymore. I wasn't in my apartment, not even in the place where I had felt the growing dread. I was standing in the middle of a long, narrow hallway that stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were cracked and peeling, the light dim, as though it had been years since anyone had bothered to care for the place. My breath caught in my throat. I reached out to steady myself against the wall, only to find my hand meeting cold stone, not the warm, familiar surfaces of my home. The air was thick and still, filled with a pungent scent of decay, as if this place had been abandoned for lifetimes. It was wrong. This wasn't supposed to happen. I tried to turn around, but the hallway behind me had vanished. There was no exit, no way back. There was only this endless corridor and the sensation of being drawn deeper into its heart. I started walking. At first, it was a slow, hesitant pace, but then I found myself moving faster. The world around me seemed to change with each step. The walls bent and twisted as though they had a life of their own, reshaping themselves in ways I couldn't understand. The floor beneath me creaked with every movement, like a body groaning under the weight of something too heavy to bear. The flickering light above me cast long, jittery shadows that danced in a way that made my skin crawl. I heard it again, the scratching. It was distant at first, barely perceptible, but as I continued walking, it grew louder. The sound was unmistakable now. Something, or someone, was following me. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to acknowledge the presence behind me, but I could feel it, its eyes, its attention, burning into the back of my neck. I knew it wasn't a person, not in the way I understood people. It was something else. Something ancient. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. I froze. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the sound itself. The absence of anything, the lack of movement or noise, made my heart pound in my chest. I was no longer sure if I was walking in this world at all. Was this real? Was this some twisted version of reality, or was I slipping further into the grip of madness? The floor beneath me began to vibrate slightly, and I felt the air grow colder, heavier. My breath formed visible clouds in the stillness. It was then that I saw it. A door. At the far end of the hall, where before there had been only more empty space, a door appeared. It was old, wooden, with rusted hinges and a tarnished doorknob. It looked like it belonged in a place like this, forgotten, decaying, with an aura of impending doom. I didn't know why, but I had to reach it. I had to open it. Each step toward the door felt like a violation, as if I were crossing an invisible line, entering territory I was never meant to tread. The scratching returned, louder, more frantic now, as though whatever was behind me had found its speed, its purpose. I could hear it getting closer, and the thudding of my own heart seemed to synchronize with the noise. But I kept walking. I reached the door. My hand was trembling as I grabbed the doorknob. It was cold. The metal was slick with something wet, and for a moment I considered turning back. But the sound, the desperate, horrible scratching, drove me forward. I twisted the knob. It was stuck. My mind screamed at me to stop, to leave, to run, but I shoved harder. The door groaned in protest, but it opened. The creak was deafening, like the scream of a dying animal. I stepped into the room. Inside, the light was even dimmer, and the air was thick with dust. It looked like an old office, abandoned for years, papers scattered on the floor, overturned furniture, and a desk cluttered with empty files and broken pens. But there was something else. Something more unsettling. On the desk was a letter. My heart skipped a beat. I knew what it was before I even touched it. It was addressed to me, in the same handwriting as before. It felt as though time itself had bent and looped, bringing me back to the place I had tried so hard to escape. With trembling hands, I unfolded the letter. "Did you think you could escape the end?" the letter began. "You cannot outrun what is already written. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. Every step you take brings you closer to the moment when you realize there is nowhere left to hide. You are part of the story now." I read the words over and over, each repetition drilling deeper into my skull. This was it. I was trapped, and the story was never going to end. The shadow, the presence, the letters, it had all been leading here, to this moment. I looked up, and the air in the room grew even colder. The shadows stretched toward me, coiling like serpents, and I felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on me, waiting, watching, expecting. And then I heard the voice again. A whisper, soft and eerie. "You were always meant to be here." The door behind me slammed shut. I turned quickly, my body frozen with terror, and saw the figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was real, solid, monstrous, its form taking shape in the dim light. The eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and the air around it shimmered with an oppressive energy. There was no way out. I had never left. This was the end. The figure stepped forward, and the world began to close in around me, its presence suffocating, all-consuming. And then, with a final, cruel twist, I understood. The letters hadn't just been predicting my death. They had been creating it. There was no escape. And in that moment, I realized that the story wasn't about me anymore. It was about whoever would receive the next letter. The next victim. The next soul trapped in the never-ending cycle. And that would be the next chapter. I don't know how much time had passed when the figure finally spoke again. It was not the voice from before. No, this time it was deeper, a guttural sound that seemed to resonate through the very walls, vibrating in my chest. "You thought you could defy it," it said, its voice a mixture of mockery and cold inevitability. But now you understand. There is no escape. There never was. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, trapped in this twisted version of reality, bound to the same relentless cycle that had begun with the very first letter. The figure stood before me, its presence filling the room, suffocating the air. It was as though it had always been there, waiting for me to fall into its grasp. And in that moment, I realized what had been wrong all along. I had thought I could outrun it. I had tried to resist the inevitable. But now I understood the letters weren't warnings. They weren't even threats. They were promises. Promises of fate's unbreakable grip. But there was something else, something more sinister. A flicker of doubt, a lingering thought that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind ever since the first letter had arrived. Something wasn't right. Something about this was different. The room seemed to distort around me once more. The walls, the shadows, the figure, all of it blurred, warping into a surreal, nightmarish version of reality. I couldn't tell if the space I was in was real or if I had simply lost all sense of time and place. I felt as though I was falling, floating between dimensions. "Do you understand?" the figure asked, its voice like a whisper in my ear. "You've always been part of this. You were never meant to break free." I couldn't answer. I didn't know how. But then, something unexpected happened. In the chaos, in the overwhelming pull of the darkness, I saw something. A glimmer. A crack in the facade. The letter. The letter on the desk. I hadn't seen it before, but now I knew what it was. It was the last one. The final letter. The one that would mark the end of everything. The one that would seal my fate forever. Without thinking, I reached for it, my hand trembling as it closed around the edge of the paper. It was cold, even colder than the air that surrounded me. I unfolded it, my heart racing as I read the words. "You cannot escape this," the letter read. "You have already chosen your path. The cycle has been completed. You are no longer the observer, but the subject. The next chapter begins with you." The words blurred as I tried to read them again, but it was no use. They had already been written. The story was already over. I had been the protagonist all along, but I had never been in control. And then, in that moment of realization, the world began to dissolve. I felt myself being pulled into the darkness, the letters slipping from my hand, fluttering away like a leaf in the wind. The room, the figure, everything around me, the reality I had once known, was vanishing, slipping through my fingers like sand. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then I was gone. But not truly gone. I don't know how much time passed before the letter arrived again, addressed to someone new. Someone who, just like me, would be drawn into the cycle. The story would continue. The cycle would repeat. And the letters would never stop coming. It was never the end. It was only the beginning. It was supposed to be just another walk in the woods. A brief escape from the clamor of everyday life, a way to clear my head. But that morning felt different, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The air was thick with an unfamiliar stillness, and the usual rustling of leaves seemed muffled, as if the trees themselves were wary of what lay ahead. I had wandered down this path countless times before, yet this time the woods felt wrong. The shadows were deeper, the light filtering through the branches more muted, as though the world itself had grown dimmer. The wind whispered in a way that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But I dismissed it as just my imagination, a trick of the mind in the solitude of nature. But then I saw it. Hidden among the thick trunks of the trees, just off the beaten trail, was something I had never noticed before, a house. It was an old, withered structure, barely standing, its once white paint peeling away like layers of forgotten memories. The windows were clouded with dirt and cobwebs, but through them I could just make out the faint outline of furniture. A shiver ran down my spine. This was no cabin for hikers or wanderers. This house was abandoned, forgotten by time. Or so it seemed. Something about it felt wrong. But curiosity got the better of me. I stepped closer, my feet crunching the underbrush as I made my way to the front door. My heart beat faster, my breath quickening with each step. I reached for the door handle, expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it turned with ease. The door creaked open, sending a chill through the air. Inside, the smell of dust and decay hit me immediately, the scent of something long untouched. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should proceed. But there was something compelling me forward, something I couldn't explain. I stepped inside. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The walls were lined with old photographs, most of them faded and yellowed with age. But what caught my attention was the furniture. It was all strangely familiar, pieces I recognized from my childhood. A rocking chair in the corner, an old wooden table with a chipped leg, and a dresser with a cracked mirror. I froze. I had never been here before, and yet everything felt like it belonged to me. The rocking chair was the one I had used when I was young, the one my grandmother had sat in when she visited. The dresser, I remembered it from my old bedroom, the one I had left behind when I moved away from my parents' house. But how could that be? How could these things be here? A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I turned, my eyes scanning the room for any explanation, but I couldn't find one. There were no signs of life, no footsteps in the dust, no recent disturbances. Everything was frozen in time, as if it had been waiting for me. I took a step forward, my feet carrying me deeper into the house. The air grew colder, and the silence was deafening. Then I heard it. A soft, barely audible sound. A rustling, like fabric brushing against something. I froze again, straining my ears to listen. It was coming from upstairs. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or some animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Someone, was upstairs. My heart raced as I slowly made my way toward the staircase, my hand gripping the banister. The stairs creaked under my weight, each step sending a shock of fear through me. When I reached the top, I paused, listening. The sound had stopped. I couldn't hear anything anymore, but the stillness felt heavier now, more oppressive. There were 2 doors at the end of the hallway. I chose the one on the left. It opened with a loud squeak, and I stepped into the room, my breath catching in my throat. It was a bedroom. A child's bedroom. But what froze me was what was on the bed. It was an old, worn teddy bear, lying on its side as if waiting to be picked up. And beside it, my name, scrawled in what looked like crayon, smeared across the wall. I couldn't breathe. How could this be? How could this bear, my name, my childhood be here? This wasn't my house. This wasn't even a house I knew. And then, as I turned to leave, I saw it. In the corner of the room, behind the door, a figure, shrouded in darkness, stood still, watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was stare into the empty, unblinking eyes of the figure, waiting for it to make its move. And then I realized it was me. I backed away from the figure, my legs trembling, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence in the room was suffocating, pressing down on me like a heavy weight. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, each inhale sharp and shallow. But the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, its presence more unnerving the longer I stared at it. I should have run, but my body refused to cooperate. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it, whatever it was. The longer I looked, the more my mind struggled to grasp what I was seeing. The figure wasn't fully formed. It was like a shadow, a distortion in the air, as if it didn't belong in this world. And yet, I felt it staring at me. No, I felt it looking straight through me, into something deeper than just my skin. I forced myself to take a step backward, then another and another, until I was standing at the edge of the room, just inches from the door. My hand reached out instinctively for the doorknob, but before I could touch it, the figure moved. It was a sudden, jerking motion, a movement so quick that it made me stumble back. But it wasn't the movement itself that terrified me, it was the sound. A sound I can't even begin to describe. It wasn't a whisper, or a groan, or a scream, it was the sound of something ancient, something twisted, like the breaking of 1,000 bones at once. It rang in my ears, vibrating through my skull. I slammed the door shut, my pulse racing, my breath shallow and erratic. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving a ringing emptiness in its wake. I stood there for a moment, eyes wide, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced, my thoughts collided with one another in a desperate attempt to understand the impossible. But before I could make any sense of it, I heard something else. A soft sound, just like before, but this time clearer. It was coming from downstairs. It wasn't the wind, not this time. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, each step measured. They echoed through the house, growing louder with each passing second. I wasn't alone. Panic surged through me. My instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of this house, to leave whatever haunted it behind. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the floor, my mind paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of dread that had taken over every inch of me. I could feel the air grow colder around me, the temperature dropping as if the house itself was closing in, suffocating me. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. And then, the whispering began. At first, it was too soft to make out. It was like a breath against my ear, a murmur just out of reach. But the longer I stood there, the clearer it became. The voice, if you could even call it that, was hollow, distant, as if it was coming from the very walls themselves. "Come closer." I flinched. The voice seemed to wrap itself around me, curling in my mind, dragging me toward the stairs, toward whatever waited below. But I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, trapped in the grip of whatever was controlling the house. "Come closer, and you'll see." I wanted to scream, to run, to break free from the grip of whatever force held me. But I was trapped. The house had become a labyrinth, its walls closing in around me, its rooms shifting, contorting as if they had a mind of their own. And then, the footsteps started again, this time louder, closer. There was no time to think. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I darted toward the stairs, my feet slipping on the old, creaking steps. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from whatever was lurking in this house, whatever was calling me. But as I reached the bottom of the stairs, I realized that the front door was no longer where it had been. The hallway that led to it had disappeared, replaced by an empty stretch of darkness. Turn back. The voice was everywhere now, swirling in my ears, pulling at my very soul. The darkness in front of me seemed to pulse, a black void that threatened to swallow me whole. I turned to the other hallway, my eyes searching for any sign of escape. But as I stepped forward, I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't the shadow I had seen before. No, this was different. This was a person. But there was something wrong with them. They were too still, too rigid, their body twisted in unnatural ways. And as I stared at them, I felt a cold, sinking sensation in my chest. It was me. But not me. The figure was dressed in clothes from my childhood, wearing a shirt I had worn years ago. Its face was pale, eyes wide open, unblinking, locked on me with a gaze that seemed to pierce through everything I was. It was a reflection of me, but it wasn't. You don't belong here. The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't in my ears, it was in my mind. I tried to move, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed, trapped between the figure and the encroaching darkness. I didn't know what was real anymore. And then, the figure began to move. It stepped forward, one jerky motion at a time, its movements disjointed, like a puppet with broken strings. My heart hammered in my chest as I tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls closed in, the darkness stretched further, and the figure, it was getting closer. You've always been here. And as I stared into the cold, lifeless eyes of my reflection, I realized the horrifying truth. I had never left. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, pressing down on me as if the house itself was alive, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The figure, my reflection, took another step forward. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, each twitch sending a sharp stab of terror through me. It was me. And yet, it wasn't. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my own frantic heartbeat pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to run, to escape. But my legs wouldn't move. It was as though the ground had turned to stone beneath my feet, anchoring me in place. The figure was now only a few feet away, its face still locked in that wide, empty stare. I could see the faint outline of my own features in its expression, the eyes that had once been filled with life, now dull and hollow. My hands shook as I reached up to touch my own face, the skin cold, as if I were standing in front of a mirror, only the reflection wasn't mine. And then, the voice came again, this time louder, clearer, as if it were coming from inside my skull. You were always meant to stay. I recoiled, shaking my head, desperately trying to clear the fog that clouded my mind. This couldn't be real. None of this could be real. My eyes darted around the hallway, searching for any sign of escape, any way out of this nightmare. But the walls had shifted. The hallway, once familiar, was now an endless expanse of dark, oppressive space. The figure reached out to me, its hand extending slowly, deliberately, as if it were savoring the moment. I could feel its cold, unseen fingers brushing against the air, sending a shiver down my spine. You never left. I stumbled backward, a sense of growing dread flooding over me. My mind was spinning. I had to get out. I had to escape. But the house was pulling me in, dragging me back into its twisted embrace. The footsteps started again, this time behind me. The sound was slow, deliberate, each footfall echoing louder than the last. It wasn't just the figure that was moving now. Something else was coming. Something worse. There's nowhere to go. I turned quickly, my eyes scanning the hallway, but there was nothing there. Just the endless stretch of darkness, swallowing everything in its path. And then, I saw it. A door. At the end of the hallway, barely visible in the dark, a door stood ajar. It beckoned to me, a sliver of light cutting through the oppressive darkness. Without thinking, I bolted toward it, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I had no idea what was on the other side, but it had to be better than staying here. Better than facing whatever nightmare this house was trying to show me. But just as my hand reached for the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. I stumbled back, my heart skipping a beat. The door was gone. The hallway was gone. Everything around me twisted, warped, as if the house itself was alive, shifting to trap me. It's too late. I froze, my blood running cold at the sound of the voice. It was everywhere now, surrounding me, suffocating me. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I couldn't tell what was real anymore. Suddenly, the floor beneath my feet gave way. I felt myself falling, tumbling through the air, the walls around me spinning like a blur. The floor had become an abyss, a void that stretched on forever. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I gasped, my vision swimming as I struggled to regain my bearings. But when I looked up, I froze in horror. I was back in the room with the rocking chair, the same room where I had first found the strange, familiar objects. The room where I had seen the figure. But now, something was different. The room was full. The rocking chair was no longer empty. It was occupied by someone. Someone who looked exactly like me, sitting perfectly still, staring at me with those hollow eyes. The figure from before. Only this time, it wasn't just standing at the corner of the room. It was waiting. And around it, the photographs, those old, faded photographs that had lined the walls, were no longer empty. They were filled with faces. Faces I recognized. Faces of my family. Of my friends. But their eyes, just like the figures, were empty. Hollow. Lifeless. They never left either. The voice was in my head, inside my thoughts, wrapping itself around every piece of my mind. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't escape the truth. The truth that this house, this place, it was all a part of me. It had always been a part of me. I wasn't just trapped in this house. I was the house. And as I looked into the eyes of the figure, I understood. It wasn't a mirror showing me my reflection. It was the past. The forgotten memories. The things I had buried so deep inside me that I had forgotten they existed. But they had never forgotten me. The house knew me. It had always known me. You belong here. And just like that, I understood the horror of it all. There was no escape. I had never left this place. This place had always been with me, hiding just beneath the surface of my mind, waiting for the right moment to pull me back in. It had finally found me. I tried to move, but my body felt frozen, paralyzed by the weight of the truth. The room spun around me as the walls seemed to close in tighter, suffocating me with their oppressive presence. The rocking chair creaked, slowly rocking back and forth, as if inviting me to take a seat, to join the other lost souls that inhabited this house. I wanted to scream, to break free from whatever twisted reality I was trapped in. but my voice caught in my throat, swallowed by the choking silence that had descended upon the house. It was as if the very air was alive, thick with the memories of all who had entered before me. You never left. The words echoed in my mind over and over like a chant that would not stop. They weren't just words. They were a promise. A truth that dug into the core of my being, twisting my very sense of reality. The house wasn't just a physical structure. It was a prison, a reflection of everything I had buried, every fear I had locked away in the recesses of my mind. The rocking chair stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. The figure, my reflection, sat motionless, its empty gaze never leaving me. I felt as though I was being drawn into its eyes, as though it was pulling me into its hollow existence, erasing me from the world I had known. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let the house swallow me whole. I turned to run, but the floor beneath me cracked open as if the very foundation of the house was crumbling away. I fell to my knees, my hands scraping against the cold, hard ground as I tried to steady myself. And then the whispers returned, louder now, frantic, as if they were growing desperate. Don't leave. You can't leave. You were never meant to leave. I covered my ears, trying to block out the voices, but they were inside me now. Inside my head. I felt the weight of the house pressing down on me, like it was consuming every thought, every memory. The walls began to pulse, beating like a heart, throbbing with the rhythm of something dark and ancient. I stood up, my legs shaking beneath me, and looked around the room. The furniture was shifting, changing, twisting into forms that were both familiar and foreign. My childhood toys, things I hadn't seen in years, appeared out of nowhere, scattered across the floor, each one more twisted than the last. The walls bled shadows, dark figures moving just beyond my vision, as if they were watching, waiting. I turned and ran, my heart racing, my mind desperate for an escape. The house seemed to stretch endlessly, its rooms shifting and rearranging as though it had no true boundaries. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know where the door was anymore. Every turn, every corridor led me deeper into the heart of the house, further from the world I had known. But then, I saw it. A doorway. This time, it was different. It wasn't a door to another room. It was a doorway to outside, a sliver of light that promised freedom, that promised a way out. Without thinking, I sprinted toward it, my breath ragged, my mind focused on nothing but escape. But as I reached the doorway, something grabbed me, something cold, like iron fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling me back. I tried to scream, to pull away, but the grip was too strong. My body was yanked backward, crashing into the floor, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my spine. And then, I saw it. The house. The walls. The floor. It was all melting, shifting, warping before my eyes. The edges of the room blurred, and I realized I was no longer in the house. I was in my mind. The house was never a place. It was a manifestation of my fears, my regrets, my buried memories. It was all inside me. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper in the dark, it was a reflection of my own thoughts, my own darkness. You can't escape yourself. I gasped, struggling to break free, but I couldn't. The figure, my reflection, was standing above me now, its hollow eyes staring down at me, its lips twitching into a smile. You can't escape. It wasn't just the house that had trapped me. It was me. I closed my eyes, trying to block it all out, but the darkness seeped into my mind. I could feel it pressing against me, invading my thoughts, my memories, erasing the distinction between reality and nightmare. The house was never real. It was always a part of me, a part of what I had become. You were always meant to stay. The figure's voice echoed through my mind, and I knew with terrifying clarity that it was true. I had never left, and I never would. The house was mine, and now I was its. Forever. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing at the edge of the forest, looking at the place where the house had once stood. But there was nothing there now, no crumbling walls, no dark windows. The forest was just forest. I blinked, confused, my mind foggy. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? It didn't make sense. It couldn't have been real. But then, as I took a step forward, I felt a cold breeze, a whisper in the wind, and the unmistakable sensation of being watched. And in the distance, beyond the trees, I saw something. A shadow. A figure standing at the edge of the forest, waiting. It was me. And it was smiling. I turned and ran, but no matter how fast I moved, no matter how far I ran, the figure was always there, waiting, watching. And I knew then, there was no escape. The air around me grew colder, the breeze now sharp, biting as I ran faster through the forest. The leaves crunched beneath my feet, the branches reaching out like twisted fingers trying to grasp at me. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath ragged, each step feeling heavier than the last. I couldn't escape. I could feel it in my bones. The figure was there, always just behind me, always following. Every time I dared to look over my shoulder, I saw it, me, standing at the edge of the trees, watching. It wasn't moving, but it was always there. Always waiting. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in around me like the walls of a maze. My mind raced. The house, the whispers, the figure, was it real? Had any of it been real? Or was this another layer of the nightmare, another twisted fragment of my own thoughts? I pushed myself harder, running blindly through the underbrush, my limbs burning with exhaustion. My head swam, the line between dream and reality blurring more with each passing second. I had to keep moving, had to escape this madness, but the more I ran, the more I felt like I was running in circles. Finally, I stumbled and collapsed to the ground, my chest heaving, the cold sweat clinging to my skin. I could feel the weight of it all, the weight of the house, the weight of the memories pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wasn't running away from something. I was running toward it. Toward the thing that had always been inside me. The figure was closer now. I didn't need to look. I could feel its presence creeping up behind me, even in the silence. You can't outrun yourself. The voice, now more familiar than my own thoughts, whispered in my ear, sending a shiver down my spine. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know if there was even anything left of me to answer. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, like they were made of stone. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. Everything around me, every branch, every shadow, every rustling leaf, felt like it was closing in on me. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. And then, in the distance, I saw it. The house. It wasn't just a memory. It wasn't just a figment of my imagination. The house had always been there. It was standing at the edge of the forest, just beyond the trees, its silhouette looming against the darkening sky. I didn't want to go back there. But something, no, someone, was pulling me toward it. It wasn't just the house calling me. It was me. I was calling myself back. With no strength left, I stood up slowly, my body trembling with fear, and I took one step forward. Then another. My feet moved of their own accord, dragging me closer to the house, to the place I had tried so desperately to escape. You can't run forever. The voice was louder now, clearer, as though it were coming from within the very walls of the house. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to listen. But I couldn't block it out. It was like a force, pulling at the very core of my being, a force I could not fight. As I stepped onto the porch, the door swung open, creaking on its hinges as though it had been waiting for me all along. The air inside was thick with dust, the same stale smell that had filled the house before. The rocking chair in the corner moved ever so slightly, as if it too was waiting for me to sit. I stepped inside, and everything changed. The walls twisted, the floor shifted beneath my feet, and the house seemed to expand around me. The rooms blurred into one another, like a maze that had no beginning and no end. I was back where it all started, but this time it felt different. This time I felt like I belonged here. I walked through the hallways, each step echoing in the silence. The house was alive, pulsating with energy, and I could feel it. I could feel its presence, feel its hunger. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a part of me. It had always been a part of me. And then I reached the door. The door that had always been there, the one that had been locked for so long. But now it was open. I stepped through, and I was back. Back in the forest. But everything was different. The trees towered over me, their twisted branches stretching out like hands, reaching for me. The ground beneath my feet was soft, as if the earth itself was alive, shifting with each step I took. The sky above was dark, the stars hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. I turned around. The house was gone, but the figure was there, standing just beyond the trees, watching. You can never leave. I didn't move. I didn't need to, because I knew in that moment that I had never really left. The house wasn't a place. It was a cycle, a loop, and I was trapped in it forever. The figure stepped forward, its hollow eyes locking onto mine, and I knew without a doubt that it wasn't just following me. It was me. The past. The future. The house. It was all the same. We were all one. You've always been here. And just as the figure reached out to me, the world went dark. It was late in the evening when my phone rang. The sudden vibration cut through the silence of my apartment, an unexpected disruption. It wasn't the usual time I received calls, and the number on the screen was unfamiliar. For a moment, I hesitated, wondering if it was a telemarketer or some other nuisance. But something in my gut told me to answer. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. "Hello?" I said, my voice a little shaky. There was a long pause on the other end. The kind of pause that stretched on too long, like the silence before a storm. I was about to hang up when a voice, deep and familiar, finally spoke. "Don't hang up. Listen to me carefully." My heart skipped a beat. That voice, it was mine. But it wasn't just that, it sounded like it was coming from a different time. The tone was younger, more urgent, as if it belonged to the person I used to be. The me that still lived in the past, before things had gone wrong. What? What do you mean? I stammered, confused. Something terrible is coming, the voice said, its tone growing more frantic. You have to prepare. There's no time to explain everything, but trust me, you need to change things. You need to make sure it doesn't happen. I pulled the phone away from my ear for a second, staring at the screen. No, it couldn't be. This had to be some sort of prank, right? But the voice on the other end felt so real, so familiar. I'm sorry, I said, trying to make sense of it. Who is this? There was another pause, and then the voice spoke again, this time with a hint of desperation. It's you, from the past. You're listening to yourself. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My hand shook as I held the phone. What did this mean? How was this possible? I didn't know if I should laugh or hang up in disbelief. Listen to me, the voice continued. Things are going to go horribly wrong. You have to stop it before it's too late. If you don't... The voice trailed off, and then the call ended abruptly, leaving only the silence of the room. For a moment, I stood there, frozen, the phone still pressed to my ear. The strange sense of familiarity hung in the air. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had just happened. Was it a prank? A dream? Or something else entirely? I looked around my apartment, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had crept over me. But the silence felt different now, heavier. I suddenly became aware of every small sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Even the air in the room seemed to shift, as if something unseen was waiting just beyond my perception. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was nothing more than a strange call. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. And if that voice had truly been mine, then what was coming? I glanced at the clock. It was already past midnight, and the city outside was still. A thick fog had rolled in, making the streetlights glow faintly in the distance. The night had a strange, oppressive quality to it, one that I couldn't shake. I paced the apartment, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Could I have imagined the call? Could my mind be playing tricks on me? Or was it something more? Something beyond explanation? I walked over to the window and pulled back the curtain, looking out into the dark street below. The fog had thickened, and the world seemed quieter than usual, as though everything was holding its breath. That's when I heard it. A soft sound. A faint rustle. It was coming from the hallway outside my apartment. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the old pipes groaning. But then it came again. A deliberate sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't expecting anyone. I turned back toward the door. The hallway outside was empty. I could see nothing through the thin sliver of space between the door and the frame. But the sound was still there, persistent, as if something, or someone, was waiting just beyond the threshold. I didn't move for what felt like forever. Then, slowly, I reached for the handle, my fingers trembling. Just as I was about to open the door, the phone rang again. This time, I didn't hesitate. I answered immediately, knowing what I would hear. "Don't open the door," the voice on the other end said, its tone sharp and urgent. "They're already here." I froze. The voice, my own voice, was trembling with fear. My hand gripped the phone tightly, the plastic cold against my ear. The voice, my voice, shuddered through the line, sending a jolt of terror down my spine. "They're already here," it repeated, this time more forcefully. "Do not open that door. You have to trust me." I was paralyzed. The fog outside the window pressed against the glass, suffocating the city in an unnatural stillness. Every sound, every creak, every whisper of movement seemed amplified in the silence. The rustling from the hallway continued, like a heavy breath against the door. "Who's here? What's happening?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might provoke something. There was a pause, too long. The voice on the other end finally spoke again, slower this time, as though each word carried a weight. "It's not them. Not the people you know. It's something you can't see. But it's there. Waiting." I swallowed hard, my heart thudding against my ribs. "What do you mean? What should I do?" The voice faltered again. "Don't let them in. You have to stay inside, and you have to wait until the morning. Don't let the darkness fool you. It's the only way to survive." I looked back at the door. It was still, but the rustling was louder now, like something was scraping along the floor. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, but the fear gripped me, rendering me silent. I started, but then there was a sudden, sharp knock. The sound of it echoed through the apartment, so loud it felt like it was coming from inside my head. I jumped, the phone almost slipping from my hand. The knock came again, more insistent this time. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was not going to leave easily. I took a step back, my breathing shallow. I had no idea what was going on, but one thing was clear: I wasn't alone. The voice on the other end spoke again, its tone growing frantic. "You have to do it now. Lock every door, every window. Don't go near it. Please. Trust me. They'll try to trick you, to make you think it's normal. Don't fall for it." The knock came again, followed by a muffled voice. "It's me. Open the door." I could barely breathe. The voice was faint, distorted, but somehow it sounded right. It sounded like someone I knew, someone I trusted. I stepped toward the door, my fingers brushing against the cool metal of the handle. My heart pounded in my chest. It couldn't be, could it? Could it really be someone I knew? I hesitated, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. I glanced at the phone, the voice still warning me in the background, but now it seemed distant, almost drowned out by the other sounds in the apartment. A whisper filled the room, a soft, almost inaudible sound. "Open the door." I reached for the handle, then stopped. Something inside me screamed to resist. This couldn't be right. It felt wrong, all wrong. The air had changed, it was thick with something unseen, something suffocating. I took a deep breath, my hand still hovering over the door. I can't open it." "You have no choice," the voice on the phone said, its desperation growing. "They're already inside your head. Don't let them inside your home. You're not safe." I stumbled back, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. The room seemed to close in on me, the walls feeling tighter with each passing second. The knocking continued, relentless. "Open the door," came the voice again, clearer now. I was almost certain it was my voice, or someone who knew me, someone familiar. The sound of it sent waves of confusion crashing through my mind. I couldn't move. I stood frozen in place as the voice on the phone continued its frantic warnings, drowned out by the noise in the hallway. And then, suddenly, it all went silent. The knocking stopped. The whispering ceased. The only sound that remained was my own breathing, ragged and panicked. I dared not move. My eyes scanned the apartment. Everything was the same, yet everything felt off. The silence seemed too complete, like the calm before something horrible. I glanced at the phone again. The line was dead. I took a slow, careful step toward the door, my hand trembling as it hovered over the handle. What was I supposed to do now? There was no answer. Only the silence that had turned oppressive. I could feel it. The presence. It was here. Whatever had been in the hallway before had slipped away, leaving only a strange sense of stillness. But I knew it wasn't over. It wasn't over by a long shot. I had to make a choice. Would I open the door? Or would I listen to the voice and try to survive whatever was coming? The silence weighed down on me, pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I stood motionless, my hand still hovering over the door handle, uncertain, paralyzed by the fear of what lay beyond. What had just happened? What was out there? The voice on the phone, my own voice, had warned me, but I hadn't acted in time. Now, I was alone in this suffocating silence, with only my thoughts and the distant sounds that had been creeping closer. I glanced over at the window. The fog had thickened even more, and the faint orange glow from the streetlights had been swallowed up by the mist. The world outside felt distant, unreal. It felt like something else was watching, something not quite human. But I couldn't put it into words. The fear I felt was different, strange, unfamiliar. I looked back at the door. The faint echo of a distant footstep seemed to drift from the hallway again, a soft scrape on the wood floor. I swallowed hard, my mind running in circles. I couldn't ignore the voice any longer. It was me, in a sense, it was my voice, telling me to trust it, to lock every door and stay hidden. But the knocking had sounded like someone I knew, someone I had trusted. Maybe it was a friend, maybe someone from my past, but now I couldn't remember clearly who they were. The voice was still lingering in my mind, its warning sharp and clear. And yet, the strange pull to open the door, to see who was really out there, was stronger now than ever. The decision felt impossible, but I knew I had to make it. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. If I listened to the voice, I would never know if the threat was real. I would live in fear, alone and hidden. But if I opened the door, the knock came again, louder this time. It's me. I know you're there. Let me in. I jumped. The sound reverberated in my bones, and I felt it in my gut. My entire body tensed, as if the very air had become thick with danger. I could hear the faintest scrape, as if someone was dragging something across the floor outside. Please, let me in. The voice was desperate now, pleading. It wasn't just a voice I recognized, it was me. It was my own voice, but twisted, as if it was calling from a place I couldn't reach. My hand was shaking as I reached for the handle. I couldn't resist anymore. My breath caught in my throat. I had to know what was on the other side. But the instant I touched the cold metal, something changed. The knocking stopped. A chill ran through my body, colder than anything I had ever felt before. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Everything was suddenly too still, too silent. It felt like I was waiting for something terrible to happen, and I couldn't escape it. The air felt different now, more suffocating, more oppressive. I pulled my hand back from the door, unwilling to touch it again. My heart pounded in my chest, threatening to burst out. I had just made a choice, even if I hadn't fully realized it. I backed away from the door, my eyes wide as I tried to make sense of everything happening around me. The shadows in the apartment seemed darker now, stretching unnaturally across the walls, like fingers reaching out to grab me. The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before, each second feeling like an eternity. And then, a sound from the hallway, soft, almost inaudible, but unmistakable. A shuffle. A whisper. Like footsteps closing in on me. I could feel it. The presence was moving closer. My breath hitched as I backed toward the far corner of the room, my eyes darting between the door and the windows. The apartment, once so familiar, now felt alien, as if the very walls were closing in on me. The distant sounds of the outside world had disappeared entirely. There was nothing but silence and this strange, heavy feeling. I couldn't stay here. I had to act. The question wasn't whether I opened the door, it was whether I could make it through the night. I rushed to the windows and tried to peer out, desperate to see something, anything, that could offer some semblance of normalcy. But the fog had swallowed the street entirely, leaving behind nothing but an endless void. My fingers pressed against the cold glass, and I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. A sound broke the silence then, sharper than anything I'd heard before, like a low hum, vibrating through the air, rising in pitch. My head ached as the sound intensified, and I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the window frame for support. It was happening. It was here. I turned, searching for something to defend myself with, but the apartment was empty. Empty except for me, and whatever was out there. I didn't know how much longer I could hold out. And then it came. A figure appeared in the doorway, its outline barely visible through the shifting fog that had poured into the room, as if the very air had conspired to conceal it. I could see the shape of it, tall and distorted, standing still in the threshold. My breath caught in my throat, and I stepped back. It was me. Not exactly. It was me, but it wasn't. The figure before me was a twisted reflection, something wrong in the way it moved, something unnatural in its posture. Its eyes were black holes, voids that swallowed the dim light of the room. The air grew colder as it stepped closer, a faint, guttural sound coming from its throat. I opened my mouth to scream, but the words caught in my throat, the terror choking me from the inside. It spoke. You were warned. And I knew, without a doubt, that it was too late. I stumbled down the hallway, my feet barely making contact with the floor as I rushed through the apartment, desperate to put distance between myself and that thing, the reflection of myself that had haunted the room. My breath came in short, panic bursts. The walls seemed to stretch farther with every step, the very air around me warping, as if it too was caught in the grip of something beyond comprehension. I reached the front door and yanked at the handle. Locked. Of course, it was locked. I fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so violently I could barely grip them. My mind raced, unable to focus on anything except the deep, gnawing sense of being watched. That presence was still there, just beyond my vision, its grip tightening with every passing second. It was in the walls. In the floor. In me. I forced the key into the lock and turned it, the familiar click echoing in the emptiness of the apartment. The door creaked open, and I rushed into the hallway, the cool night air outside hitting my face like a slap. I didn't stop to think. I just ran. The street outside was shrouded in that same, suffocating fog. The city was eerily quiet, the usual hum of traffic and distant voices absent. The world around me felt wrong, like it had been drained of life, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something was just behind me. Watching. Waiting. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford to. I ran for what felt like an eternity, my body protesting the exertion, my lungs burning. But I couldn't stop. I didn't know what was chasing me. I didn't know what had followed me from that apartment. All I knew was that I couldn't let it catch me. Not now. Not ever. But as the fog thickened, I began to realize that no matter how fast I ran, the distance between me and whatever was chasing me remained the same. It was like I was running in place. The buildings around me blurred into indistinct shapes, their outlines swallowed up by the dense mist. Suddenly, I was no longer sure of where I was. The streetlights that had once guided me were now distorted, their glow twisted and hollow, casting long shadows that moved of their own accord. I reached for my phone, desperate to make sense of what was happening. But the screen was blank, the battery dead. I stopped in the middle of the street, gasping for air, and looked around. There was no one. No cars. No sound. It was as if the world had been frozen in place, waiting for something terrible to unfold. And then it happened. A low hum, barely perceptible at first, filled the air. The ground beneath me seemed to vibrate, a subtle, rhythmic pulsing. I couldn't explain it, but it was like the entire world was breathing, and the sound was growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't the hum of traffic or machinery. It was deeper, darker, like the very earth was alive with something unseen. Something ancient. I looked around, panic rising in my chest. The street was empty, the fog thickening around me. The hum was now accompanied by a low whisper, a voice that seemed to be coming from all directions. Run, run while you can. It was my voice again. But it wasn't coming from the phone. It was coming from the very air, as if it was all around me, wrapping itself around my thoughts. I closed my eyes, my hands pressed to my ears, trying to block out the voice. But it only grew louder, more insistent, like it was burrowing deep inside my mind. You can't escape it. You can't outrun it. I stumbled backward, my legs buckling beneath me. I had nowhere to go. The street had become a labyrinth of endless fog, every direction leading to the same crushing silence. The voice wasn't just in my ears now, it was inside me, like a parasite, feeding on my fear. The hum became a roar, the ground trembling beneath me. The air itself seemed to warp and twist. I looked up and saw the figure. It was there, standing at the far end of the street, bathed in an unnatural light. Its eyes, those black, empty eyes, locked onto mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was the reflection. The thing that had followed me. And now it had caught up. The figure began to move toward me, its steps slow, deliberate. Each movement was like a shift in reality itself, as if it was dragging the very fabric of the world along with it. The fog parted in its wake, but not in a way that brought clarity. No, the fog thickened, became more oppressive, swallowing everything in its path. I tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I tried to scream, but my throat closed, the air heavy and thick with something that made it impossible to let out a sound. The figure was closer now, and I could see it clearly. It wasn't me. It was worse than that. It was everything I had been afraid of, every mistake, every regret, every choice I had made that had led me to this moment. It was the end. And just as it reached me, the world seemed to bend. Time stretched, distorted, and then, for a fleeting moment, everything was still. A deep, agonizing silence. And then, just as suddenly, everything collapsed. The fog, the figure, the hum, everything disappeared in an instant, leaving me standing alone on a quiet street, the city no longer shrouded in mist. The air was still. The world was empty. But I wasn't alone. I could still hear it. The whisper. You've made your choice. And then, nothing. I looked around, trying to make sense of what had happened. Had I escaped? Had I been freed from the nightmare? But I knew, deep down, that it wasn't over. Not really. It would never be over. Have you ever wondered what secrets your own home might be hiding? What if, during some routine repair, you stumbled upon something so strange, so chilling, that it completely changed everything you thought you knew about the place you've lived in for years? I never expected to find anything unusual when I started the renovations in my house. It was an old place, built in the early 1900s, and the walls had been creaking and groaning for as long as I could remember. The cracks in the plaster were getting worse, and I figured it was time to do some basic repairs. Nothing too major, just patching up some holes and smoothing out the walls in the spare room. But as I chipped away at the drywall, the sound of the hammer hitting the old, brittle plaster filled the air in a way that seemed oddly hollow, almost as if there was more to the wall than I had originally thought. At first, I dismissed it as the usual sound of age and decay. But when the wall gave way, revealing an opening behind it, a sharp, instinctive feeling crawled up my spine. It wasn't supposed to be there. What I saw beyond the hole was not a typical attic or storage space, but a small, hidden room. It was cold, unnaturally cold, and the air smelled stale, like something had been locked away for a very long time. A faint, musty light filtered in from the cracks, enough for me to see what lay within. I stepped cautiously into the space, my breath shallow in my chest. The room was bare, save for a collection of framed photographs pinned to the walls. The odd thing? The people in the photos weren't familiar to me. They didn't look like any of the previous owners of the house, nor did they resemble anyone I knew. They were all different ages, different races, and dressed in various time periods, but they all had one thing in common: each one of them had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, their faces forever frozen in time. I didn't know any of these people. And yet, as I stared at their faces, a strange sense of familiarity settled deep in my gut. I couldn't explain it. I felt like I knew them, or at least, like I should. Some of the photographs were dated, others not, but they all seemed to watch me in eerie silence, their eyes following my every movement. A few steps further into the room, and I noticed something even stranger. There were markings on the floor, faint lines and scratches that seemed to lead in a circular pattern, almost like a ritualistic symbol. It made my skin crawl. I didn't want to touch anything, but a sudden compulsion to find out more gripped me. I knelt down, inspecting the strange symbols when a low, almost imperceptible sound reached my ears. It was the sound of a faint tapping, like fingers gently brushing against wood. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowly turned my head to look back at the wall. The tapping continued, but it wasn't coming from the room, nor the house. It was coming from behind the wall, from where I had just broken through. I stood up, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it. I stepped closer to the hole I had created and peered inside. There was nothing there, just an empty, dark space that felt as though it was waiting for something. But the tapping persisted. It grew louder now, clearer, like a soft knocking, urging me to do something I couldn't quite name. Suddenly, I realized the photographs on the wall weren't just there for decoration. Each one of them had a small note beneath it, scribbled in a hurried, desperate hand. I leaned in to read one, my fingers trembling slightly as I touched the paper. The ink was faded, but the message was clear. Don't go further. It sees you. I felt the room grow colder still, the air thickening around me. My eyes flicked from the note to the tapping, now louder and more insistent. Something was behind that wall. Something or someone. But what? And why was I suddenly so afraid to find out? I wanted to leave. I should have turned around and walked out. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was a pull on my chest, something drawing me deeper into the room, into the mystery of the photographs, and the strange knocking behind the wall. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and reached for the hammer. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but whatever it was going to uncover it. As I raised the hammer to strike again, a chill ran through my body, and a voice, soft, almost a whisper, sounded from nowhere. Don't open it. I froze, my grip on the hammer tightening. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't from anyone I knew. It wasn't even from inside the room. It came from the photographs. The eyes of the people in them seemed to darken, and suddenly, I was sure they were no longer just watching me. They were waiting. The knocking intensified. Something told me that if I continued, I might not be able to leave. Something told me that behind that wall was not just an empty space, but something far worse, something that had been waiting for years to be found. But there was no turning back now. I swung the hammer into the wall again, and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the cold wooden floor, my head throbbing with a dull ache. The room, once bathed in dim light, was now engulfed in darkness. My breath came in shallow gasps, and the weight of the silence felt suffocating. It was as if the world itself had held its breath, waiting for something. I pushed myself up slowly, my limbs stiff and uncooperative. My fingers grazed the broken pieces of drywall scattered across the floor, and I realized with a jolt that I had somehow been knocked out. My eyes strained in the dark, but there was no light. No sound except for the distant pounding in my skull. I reached for my phone in my pocket. No signal. The screen was cracked, and the battery had died completely. It was as though the whole house had been swallowed up by the darkness. I stood up, feeling the weight of the air pressing against me. The room around me seemed to have changed. The photographs, those haunting faces, were no longer on the wall. In their place, I could see only bare patches of plaster, as if they had never been there at all. But the tapping was still there. The same rhythmic knock, 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 echoing from behind the wall. It had intensified, now louder and quicker, like the frantic sound of someone desperate to get out. I moved closer, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath caught in my throat as I placed my ear against the wall. The noise was unmistakable. It was coming from inside, not behind. Something, or someone, was on the other side, moving, trying to break through. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I swore I could hear whispers, soft, unintelligible voices, drifting in from the shadows. I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner, but there was no one. No one in sight. Just the sound of the tapping, relentless. And then, the whispers grew clearer, louder, almost frantic. I could hear words now. Help, help us. It wasn't just one voice. It was many. A chorus of desperate cries. But they weren't pleading for help from me, they were warning me. Don't stay here. Get out. I felt my knees weaken, and my mind began to race, trying to make sense of the chaos in my head. Had I gone mad? Was this some hallucination triggered by the stress of the renovation? Or was there truly something behind that wall, something that I wasn't meant to find? I stumbled backward, my breath ragged, eyes wide. The knocking had stopped. But now, there was a sound even more unsettling, a low groan, like wood straining under immense pressure. The wall before me seemed to shimmer, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. The photographs, they were back. But this time, they were different. The faces that had once been frozen in time were now alive, their expressions contorted in agony. Their eyes followed me, no longer static, but full of terror. Their mouths opened in silent screams, their bodies twisted and distorted. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. I was transfixed. My skin crawled, and a sickening coldness spread through my chest. The whispers grew louder, filling my head until it felt like they were coming from inside my skull. I had to leave. I couldn't stay here. But no matter how much I willed my body to move, I felt rooted to the spot. The house had become a prison, and the walls seemed to close in around me, tightening with every breath I took. And then, as if to confirm my deepest fear, the wall cracked open. A deep, jagged fissure appeared, widening slowly, like the mouth of a creature waiting to devour me. From the crack, a hand emerged. It was pale, almost lifeless, the skin stretched tight over the bones. Long, twisted fingers reached out, scraping the edges of the opening with a soft, horrible sound. The hand twitched, and then it was followed by another, this one skeletal and sharp, its fingers curling toward me with a predatory grace. I stumbled back, terror seizing me. The whispers had turned into frantic screams, and I was drowning in the cacophony of voices. I could feel the weight of their fear, pressing down on me like a physical force. I turned to run, but the air felt thick and sticky, as if it was holding me back, preventing my escape. The room had shifted completely now. What was once a small hidden space had expanded, the walls stretching out, the ceiling rising higher. It felt as though the house itself had come alive, twisting and reshaping around me, pulling me deeper into its suffocating grip. The wall cracked wider, and I saw it, what was on the other side. It wasn't just a room. It was a labyrinth of faces. Faces of the people in the photographs, now twisted and broken, their bodies suspended in space, their eyes wide open and empty. They were all reaching out, trapped in an endless cycle of horror, forever bound to this place. Their screams echoed in my ears, mingling with the whispers, a chorus of endless despair. And then, I saw something worse, a figure in the center of the room, standing amidst the chaos. It was tall, its form obscured by the shifting darkness, but I could see its eyes, black, hollow, empty. It was watching me. I turned to run again, my feet moving instinctively, but my legs were weak, my vision blurred by terror. I couldn't get away. I couldn't escape. The walls began to close in. The faces reached for me, their fingers brushing my skin, pulling at my clothes, trying to drag me back. And then, I heard a voice, clear and sharp, cutting through the chaos. You shouldn't have opened the wall. I didn't need to turn around to know that it was speaking to me. I could feel its presence, closing in on me, suffocating me. I was trapped. And no matter how hard I tried to scream, the voices around me drowned out every sound I made. The darkness swallowed me whole. I had uncovered the secret of the wall. But now, the wall had claimed me too. The first thing I felt was the cold. It wrapped around me like a damp, suffocating blanket, as though the very air had turned into ice. I couldn't see, everything was dark, the oppressive kind of dark that made it feel like the world had ceased to exist. My chest was tight, every breath harder to take than the last. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. My limbs felt like they were made of stone, heavy and unyielding. I strained to open my eyes, but the darkness seemed to press against them, making it impossible to see. There were no sounds, no whispers, no tapping. Only silence. Absolute silence. Then, slowly, just at the edge of my consciousness, I became aware of something. A hum. Faint, but undeniable. It was like the vibrations of an old machine or the buzz of an electric current running through the walls. The hum seemed to come from everywhere, vibrating deep into my bones, filling the air with a strange sense of anticipation. I forced myself to focus, my thoughts slowly clearing, and I realized with growing horror that I wasn't alone. There was something in the darkness with me. A presence. It was there, just beyond my reach, but I could feel it. I could feel it watching me, studying me. I tried to move again, this time with more force, but my body remained frozen, as if the very walls were holding me in place. I couldn't speak. I couldn't cry out for help. I was completely paralyzed, trapped in this suffocating void. My heart raced, panic rising in my throat, but no sound came out. Only the hum. It was growing louder now, closer, as if whatever it was had moved just a little bit nearer. I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, but there was no escape. The darkness was a thick, viscous thing, pulling me deeper into its grasp, consuming every part of me. The walls around me seemed to pulse, almost alive, as if they could feel the fear that radiated from me. It was as if they were feeding off it, growing stronger with every passing moment. Suddenly, I felt a shift. A crackling, like the sound of electricity sparking to life. The walls seemed to ripple, as if they were made of something other than solid matter. They moved, stretching outward, pulling me in with them. The air grew heavier, thicker, and I gasped for breath, but it felt like there was no air left to breathe. I was being drawn into something. A trap, a nightmare, a place where time didn't exist. The room, or whatever this place was, seemed to bend around me, warping and twisting. The more I struggled, the more the walls pressed in, as if they were trying to merge with me, to consume me. And then, just as I thought I might lose myself completely to the dark, I heard it. A voice. A voice that wasn't my own, but it was familiar. It was the voice from before, the one that had whispered in the room. Don't fight it. You're already part of it. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating through the emptiness like a distant warning. It wasn't speaking to me, it was speaking of me, as if I had become something else, something beyond the person I had been before. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, or if time had any meaning here at all. But I knew one thing for sure, I was no longer alone. The hum turned into a low, guttural growl, as though something ancient, something far beyond my understanding, was waking. The walls trembled, and I could feel the vibrations all around me, in my bones, in my skin, in my very soul. The presence I had felt before was no longer hidden, it was here, with me, closer than ever. I was suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move, couldn't escape. But the voice came again, sharper this time, filled with a terrible finality. You will never leave. You will become part of the wall. The words were a death sentence. A cruel promise. And for the first time, I understood what had happened to the people in those photographs. They hadn't disappeared. They had been absorbed, just like I was being absorbed now, trapped in the walls, their faces twisted and distorted, their souls forever bound to this place. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my throat. I wanted to fight, to claw my way out of the suffocating darkness, but I couldn't move. The walls pressed in tighter, the hum growing louder until it drowned out all thought, all feeling, until there was nothing left but the oppressive, consuming silence. And then, the last thing I felt was a cold hand, long, skeletal fingers, brushing against my skin. And everything went still. I was no longer in the room. I was no longer in the house. I was part of the wall now, part of the darkness that stretched endlessly beyond. I could feel the other souls with me, lost in the void, their faces flickering in and out of my consciousness. And I understood. I wasn't the first to find this secret, but I would be the last. Time had lost its meaning. There were no clocks here, no way to measure the passing of days or years. It felt as though I had always been here, and yet I could still remember a life before the wall. It was like a dream now, distant and fading, slipping through my fingers as I tried to grasp onto it. But I wasn't alone. I could feel them, the others, trapped like I was. Their presence was like a cold, creeping shadow, always just out of reach but never gone. I could sense their fears, their regrets, their anguish, all tangled together in an unending loop of despair. They were part of the wall now, their faces forever etched into its surface, their voices reduced to whispers in the dark. And I could hear them, their muffled cries for help, their desperate pleas for release. But there was no release. Not here. Not in this place. The wall was alive. It moved and breathed, shifting in ways that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a physical barrier, it was a living, breathing thing, a creature that fed off fear, off the terror of those trapped within it. The more afraid I became, the stronger it grew, its tendrils reaching deeper into my mind, into my soul. I tried to resist, tried to fight back against the suffocating darkness, but the more I struggled, the more the wall consumed me. The boundaries between me and the others began to blur. I could see their faces now, those who had come before me, their features twisted in agony. They stared at me from the surface of the wall, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent screams. I reached out to them, desperate for some kind of connection, some sign that they were still human, still alive inside this prison. But as my hand touched the cold stone, the faces shifted, becoming more grotesque, more monstrous. The whispers grew louder, as if they were speaking directly into my mind, urging me to join them, to let go of whatever was left of my humanity. Let it in, one voice whispered, the sound like nails scraping against metal. You can't escape. We never could. Another voice joined in, this one softer, more pleading. You're one of us now. There's no way out. The wall will keep you. I stumbled back, horrified. This wasn't me. This couldn't be me. I hadn't become like them. I couldn't have. But as I looked around, I realized the truth. I was part of it now. The wall had claimed me, just as it had claimed all the others before me. There was no escape. There would never be an escape. But I couldn't accept it. I couldn't give in. I closed my eyes, focusing all my energy on the memory of the world outside. The warmth of the sun, the sound of birds singing, the feel of the wind on my face. I held onto those memories with everything I had, hoping that somehow they could save me from this nightmare. For a brief moment, I felt something familiar, something that didn't belong to this place. A flicker of hope. But it was fleeting. The wall pulsed again, and the sensation was gone. I felt myself being pulled back into its depths, my mind sinking further into the dark, into the endless cycle of despair that had claimed all those before me. I was becoming one of them. The wall was winning. But as I slipped further into the darkness, I heard it again. A voice. It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was there. Don't give up. Fight. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to hold on to that sliver of hope, to think that there was a way out. But I didn't know if I had the strength to keep fighting. The wall was too powerful. It was too deep. The faces pressed closer, their eyes locked onto mine. They were waiting for me to give in, to accept my fate and join them in eternal silence. They were so close, their cold, dead eyes staring into mine, and I could hear their voices, the whispers of those who had been trapped long before me. And then I saw it. The crack. A thin, jagged line that appeared in the wall just beyond the reach of my outstretched hand. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A faint light seeped through the crack, spilling into the dark, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt something other than fear. I felt hope. I reached for the crack, my fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold stone. The light grew brighter, and the wall seemed to shift, as if it were reacting to my touch. The whispers grew louder, frantic now, as if the wall itself was trying to pull me back. But I wouldn't stop. I couldn't. I pulled at the crack with all my strength, my nails scraping against the stone as I forced it open just a little more. The light grew, blinding now, and I could feel the pull of the wall lessening. For the first time since I had entered this nightmare, I felt like I was in control. And then, with one final, desperate push, the crack opened wider. A rush of cold air hit my face, and I saw it. The outside world. The sky. The sun. The real world, just beyond the wall. I wasn't free yet, but I had a chance. I took a deep breath, gathering every ounce of strength I had left. The whispers were still there, still trying to drag me back into the darkness. But I wasn't going to let them win. With a final, resolute push, I broke through. The world beyond was bright, almost blinding in its intensity. I stumbled out of the wall, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I was free. I was alive. But as I turned to look back at the wall, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The crack was closing. Slowly. Relentlessly. And I knew, with a sickening certainty, that there was no escaping it. Not for me. And not for anyone who might come after. I left the house that day, but the wall didn't let me go. It followed me, unseen but ever present. The whispers never stopped. They taunted me in the silence of the night, echoed in the corners of my mind. I could still hear them, feel them, just as I had when I was trapped in that place. And I knew that the wall would always be there, waiting for the next person to open it. And I would always be there, trapped in its endless cycle. Because once the wall claimed you, you could never truly leave. Not really. The first night I spent outside the house, in the safety of the world I had once known, I thought I had escaped. The air was crisp, fresh with the scent of rain, and the streets were quiet, peaceful. The normality of it all almost lulled me into a sense of calm. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The sensation that something, someone, was always watching me. I slept fitfully, tossing and turning, my dreams plagued by the faces from the wall. They haunted me, their expressions frozen in terror, their eyes pleading for help. I would wake up, heart racing, only to find the world just as it had been when I went to sleep, empty, cold, unchanged. But something had shifted in me. I could feel it deep inside, a gnawing sense of dread that grew stronger with each passing day. The whispers, those damn whispers, followed me wherever I went. I couldn't escape them. No matter how far I traveled, no matter how many walls I put between myself and the house, they were there, just beyond my consciousness, clawing at the edges of my sanity. And then, I started to see it. At first, it was subtle, a flicker out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that moved just a bit too quickly. But over time, it grew more pronounced. Faces, those same twisted, agonized faces, would appear in mirrors, in windows, in the darkened corners of rooms. Sometimes they would just stand there, staring at me with those hollow eyes. Other times, they would whisper my name, their voices a soft, eerie chant, almost as though they were waiting for me to join them. One evening, after an entire day of being followed by this unseen presence, I decided to return to the house. I had to. I needed answers, even if they were terrifying. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that tied me to the house, to the wall. The house was empty when I arrived. The door was unlocked, and the silence inside was oppressive. It smelled musty, as though it had been abandoned for years, even though I had only been gone for a few days. I wandered through the rooms, the floor creaking under my feet, and paused in front of the wall where I had discovered the hidden room. My breath caught as I approached. It was there again. The crack. Thin, jagged, but undeniable. It had appeared while I was gone, silently, as if the house had been waiting for me to return. The air around it was heavy, charged with something dark and malevolent. I reached out to touch it, but as my fingers brushed against the stone, I recoiled in pain. It burned, the contact like fire running through my skin, sharp and searing. I pulled my hand back and stumbled away, but my gaze remained fixed on the wall. I could feel the eyes of the faces on the other side, watching me. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. "Come back," they beckoned. "You can never truly leave." I turned, heart pounding, and ran through the house, down the stairs, and out the door. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town. I thought I could outrun it, that I could escape it for good. But it was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. Days passed, and I tried to live a normal life. I tried to convince myself that I had made it out, that the wall was behind me. But the more I tried to move on, the more I realized that it wasn't over. It was never over. The wall had marked me, and no matter where I went, I would always carry that mark with me. I began to see the signs everywhere, on the streets, in the faces of strangers, in the reflections of windows. The mark was there, subtle but unmistakable. The same crack, the same distortion in reality, the same unnatural hum that had echoed in the house. It was spreading, reaching out to claim more lives. I wasn't the only one. There were others. They didn't know what they were being drawn to, but they were being pulled toward the same place. The house. The wall. The cycle. It had all started again, and I was caught in its pull, unable to break free. The final, terrible truth settled in my mind like a cold, suffocating weight. The wall wasn't just in the house. It was everywhere. It had seeped into the world, into reality itself, and there was no escaping it. Once you were marked, once you were part of the wall, you were trapped forever. There was no going back. And so, I walked. I walked through the streets, through the cities, through the world, carrying the wall with me. I tried to warn people, tried to make them understand what was happening, but they couldn't see it. They couldn't feel it. The wall was always there, and it was always waiting. And I knew that sooner or later, someone else would open it. Someone else would discover the secret of the wall, and they would join me. They would join all of us. And the cycle would continue. Because once the wall claimed you, there was no escape. And I would always be here, waiting for the next soul to find the crack. Waiting for the next one to be marked. Have you ever wondered if the water around you sees more than just its reflection? That maybe, just maybe, it's looking into your soul, watching your every thought, your every move? Or worse, what if the water could see your dreams? I never used to believe in such things. I thought dreams were just fleeting fragments of my subconscious, something to laugh about in the morning and forget by midday. But that was before I came to the lake. It started innocently enough. I needed a break, something quiet to clear my mind. So, when I found this secluded spot by the lake, far away from the noise and bustle of the world, I thought I had found the perfect escape. The place was peaceful. The water was still, and the air was crisp and fresh, filling my lungs with a calming breath. I set up my tent near the shore, unpacked my things, and spent the evening fishing, reading, and watching the stars emerge one by one as the sky darkened. But by the time night settled in, something felt off. At first, it was just a flicker of something strange. When I stood by the lake, gazing into its surface, I thought I saw something moving beneath the water, an unfamiliar shape shifting in the depths. It wasn't a fish. It was more like a shadow, constantly changing its form. I convinced myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me in the dim light. That night, I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the gentle sounds of the water lapping against the shore and the distant rustle of trees in the wind. My dreams were vivid, almost too real. I was walking through an unfamiliar house, an old place with creaky wooden floors and walls lined with old portraits. Faces in those portraits stared at me with hollow eyes, their expressions frozen in time. I felt a chill run down my spine as I walked past them, but I couldn't turn back. I had to keep going. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I turned, but no one was there. The house was empty, silent, save for the thudding of my own heart in my chest. And then, I saw it. The reflection. It was the lake, or something like it, an exact replica of the one I had been fishing by earlier that day. But this time, the water wasn't calm. It was moving, swirling in slow, deliberate circles. And beneath the surface, I could see a figure, someone standing just below the water's surface, watching me. Their face was familiar, but I couldn't place it. The figure reached out, its fingers brushing the water's surface as if trying to touch me. I woke up with a start, my heart racing, and the sound of my breath ragged in my ears. The room around me was dark, the soft glow of moonlight filtering through the tense fabric. I sat up, my hand instinctively reaching out to touch my forehead. I felt cold, the skin clammy with sweat. But as I looked toward the lake, the strange feeling from my dream lingered. I stood up and walked to the shore. The water was still, just as it had been earlier, and the night was silent. There were no figures beneath the surface, no shapes moving in the depths. I shook my head, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. It's just a dream, I muttered to myself. Nothing more. But as I turned to head back to my tent, something caught my eye. A ripple in the water, slow and deliberate, like a hand moving beneath the surface. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. I turned back to the lake, staring into its depths. There was nothing there. No figure, no movement. Just the dark, still water reflecting the moonlight above. I shook my head again, trying to clear the fog of confusion that clouded my mind. "It's just the wind," I whispered, forcing myself to believe it. But that night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure again, the one in the water. Its face, unfamiliar yet somehow hauntingly close, staring back at me. When morning came, the sun rose in a brilliant red, casting an eerie glow across the lake. I tried to forget the strange feeling from the night before, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching me. The water still seemed to hold its secrets, as if it knew things I wasn't meant to see. As I spent the next day by the lake, the strange feeling only grew stronger. The breeze felt colder than before, the shadows deeper. And every time I looked at the water, I couldn't help but notice something just in the corner of my vision, shifting beneath the surface. But the strangest thing happened that evening. As I gazed into the lake, something new appeared. It was me. Not my reflection, but a version of me I didn't recognize. My eyes were empty, my face pale, twisted with fear. The figure in the water mimicked my movements exactly, but its face was the one from my dream. The figure raised its hand, and I felt my own hand move in response, as if I was no longer in control. The water seemed to pulse, alive, as if it were trying to communicate, trying to show me something I wasn't ready to understand. And just like that, my world began to shift, bending the line between what was real and what was dream. I should have left then. But I didn't. I couldn't. The following night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn to the lake. It wasn't just a lingering curiosity, it felt like an irresistible pull, like the water was calling me, beckoning me closer with a voice only my mind could hear. I couldn't stop thinking about the figure in the water, the distorted version of myself, its hollow eyes, and the twisted smile that seemed to linger long after I turned away. It haunted me. Even in the daylight, when I was supposed to be safe, I could feel its presence. I couldn't look at the lake without a chill running down my spine. I tried to distract myself with other things, fishing, reading, wandering through the woods, but nothing could pull my attention away from the water. It was like it had become the center of my world, the place where everything I knew and believed in started to unravel. That night, I stood by the shore again, staring at the calm surface of the lake. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its light across the water, making it shimmer with an unnatural, almost otherworldly glow. I couldn't help myself. I took a step closer, my bare feet sinking into the soft mud at the edge of the lake. It was then that I saw it again. The water rippled, disturbed by something beneath the surface. It wasn't wind this time, nor a fish. The ripples were controlled, deliberate, as if whatever was beneath the water knew I was watching. I leaned closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I saw it, my reflection, but not in the way it should have been. The figure in the water didn't mimic my every movement. Instead, it seemed to move independently, as though it had a life of its own. The eyes, black and unblinking, fixed on me, and for a moment, I swore they weren't my eyes at all. The figure reached up, its fingers stretching toward the surface, and for a brief, terrifying instant, I thought it might crawl out of the water and onto the shore. I recoiled, stepping back, but the figure's hand remained suspended just beneath the surface, as if it were waiting for me to come closer. The air around me grew colder, and the sounds of the forest faded into an eerie silence. I could hear nothing except the beating of my own heart in my ears, growing faster and faster, louder and louder. My breath was shallow, and my body trembled with fear. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the water, from the figure that continued to reach out, its movements growing more frantic as if it was desperate to make contact. Then, a voice, soft, barely a whisper, echoed through my mind. It wasn't my own voice. It wasn't even a voice at all, just a feeling, a presence, something intangible but unmistakable. Come closer. I didn't want to listen. I knew better. I knew that whatever this was, it wasn't natural. But I couldn't stop myself. I took a step forward, my body moving against my will, as though something was controlling me, pulling me toward the water. The figure's hand emerged fully from the surface, pale and twisted, fingers long and thin like claws. It reached toward me, its touch cold and numbing, like death itself. But I couldn't pull away. My feet were rooted to the ground, my body unwilling to move. Come closer, the voice whispered again, louder this time, filled with an urgency that made my skin crawl. The hand in the water curled, beckoning me to come and join it. And then I felt it, the unmistakable sense that I wasn't just seeing the figure. I was becoming it. I was losing myself to it, my very soul being pulled into the depths of the lake. The world around me began to blur, the trees, the moon, the shore, all fading into darkness as the water's surface became all-consuming, pulling me deeper and deeper. I screamed, but no sound escaped my lips. My legs gave out beneath me, and I fell to my knees, my eyes never leaving the figure in the water. My body trembled, frozen in place, as the world around me disappeared. All I could see, all I could feel, was the cold grip of the water, the presence of the figure, and the voice calling me into the depths. Just as I thought I would be swallowed whole, I managed to break free. With every ounce of strength, I forced myself to stand, stumbling away from the shore. The grip on my mind loosened, and I ran away from the lake, away from the pull of the water. But as I ran through the woods, my thoughts began to twist and warp, the world around me becoming a blur of shapes and shadows. The trees seemed to close in, the branches reaching down like hands, trying to grab me. I heard the whispers again, the voice calling me, urging me to return. I reached the tent, my heart pounding in my chest, my body soaked in sweat. I collapsed inside, locking the zipper tightly, but the sound of the whispers didn't fade. It was like they were inside my mind now, echoing through my skull, louder and more insistent with each passing moment. The lake was still there, somewhere in the distance, its surface calm and undisturbed. But I knew it was waiting for me. It was always waiting. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure again, reaching for me. Every shadow, every creak of the tent in the wind seemed to carry the whispers of the lake, growing closer and closer until it felt like they were right next to me. I didn't know how much longer I could stay here, how much longer I could fight the pull of the water. But I knew one thing for certain, I was no longer alone. And the lake wasn't just reflecting my dreams anymore. It was controlling them. And I was afraid of what it would show me next. The morning light barely broke through the dense trees, casting weak rays that filtered through the tent's thin fabric. I awoke with a start, the air thick with the same unease that had settled over me the night before. My body felt heavy, like I had been dragged through the night, physically and mentally exhausted. But it wasn't the tiredness that weighed on me the most. It was the nagging fear that had followed me into my sleep. I could still hear the whispers, distant but present, tugging at my mind like an invisible thread, pulling me back toward the lake. I wanted to escape, run away from this place, from whatever it was that had begun to bleed into my waking reality. But I couldn't bring myself to leave. Not yet. I stumbled out of the tent, the cold morning air biting into my skin. I stood for a moment, trying to collect my thoughts, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. But the feeling was impossible to ignore. The forest felt different today, unearthingly still. The birds, usually so loud and active at dawn, had fallen silent. Even the breeze that rustled through the trees seemed muted, as if holding its breath. I glanced at the lake, its surface smooth and glass-like, reflecting the sky above in a way that almost made it look like it was a mirror that could see things I couldn't. The pull was there again, stronger this time, almost magnetic. My heart pounded as I took a step closer to the water's edge. I didn't want to go, but it was like my feet moved on their own, dragging me forward despite my best efforts to resist. The air grew colder the closer I got, a chill that seeped into my bones, making my skin prickle with fear. As I reached the shore, my reflection in the water seemed to flicker. I looked at it, my pulse quickening. It wasn't just the usual distorted version of myself that I'd seen the night before. It was different now. It was clearer, sharper, more real. But something wasn't right. My reflection, it was smiling at me, a wide, unsettling grin that stretched too far, too unnatural. My heart stopped. This wasn't me. I hadn't moved my mouth, but there it was, my reflection, smiling, mocking me. Suddenly, I heard it, quiet, almost a hum, but unmistakable in its intensity. "Come closer." The voice was inside my head again, its tone soothing yet full of an unsettling promise. It was as if the lake itself was speaking to me, its dark depths calling me into them. I couldn't look away from the water. The reflection now seemed to beckon me, its smile widening even more. I felt myself leaning forward, unable to resist, as though the water itself was pulling me in. The voice grew louder, more insistent, its words twisting into something darker. "You don't have to fight it. Come and see what I've shown you." I knew that if I stepped into the water, I would be lost. The lake wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a body of water. It was something else, something that had been watching me, waiting for me. My reflection, it wasn't me anymore. It was something else entirely. Something that wanted to take my place. I stumbled back, my legs trembling beneath me, my breath shallow. The reflection's grin never wavered, its eyes gleaming with something that wasn't human. I didn't know how, but I could feel it watching me, tracking my every move, knowing what I was going to do before I did it. I had to leave. I had to escape. I turned away from the water, but as I did, a horrible thought crossed my mind. What if the lake wasn't just reflecting my dreams? What if it was making them? What if everything I had seen, everything I had experienced since I arrived here, was nothing but the lake's design, its twisted game? I shook my head, trying to clear the thought, but it clung to me like a shadow. I had to get away from here. I had to leave this place before it consumed me, before I became part of its endless nightmares. But as I walked back toward the camp, something stopped me. A sound. A soft, muffled splash, like something was moving in the water. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. My eyes darted back to the lake. For a moment, the surface was still, but then, as though answering my fear, the water rippled, just slightly. And then, I saw it. A figure. It was standing in the lake, just beyond the edge, the water up to its waist. It was humanoid, but twisted. The face was barely distinguishable, only two black eyes staring back at me, hollow and empty. Its body was contorted, as if something unnatural was holding it upright. Its limbs were too long, too thin, and the fingers were claws. It didn't move, not at first, but I could feel it watching me. I could feel it waiting. The whispers started again, soft at first, then louder, as if the lake itself was breathing in time with my own rapid heartbeat. Come closer. I knew what it wanted. It wanted me to join it, to be part of the water, part of the reflection, part of the dream. But I couldn't. I couldn't let it take me. With everything I had left, I turned and ran, not looking back, not allowing myself to be drawn into its depths. But no matter how far I ran, I knew it was still there, waiting for me to return, to let the water claim me. I didn't know how much longer I could resist. But I also knew that it wouldn't stop until I did. Until I let it take me. And I couldn't help but wonder, was I already too late? The ground beneath my feet felt unstable as I sprinted back toward the camp. Every step seemed to echo in my head, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, the sound of water splashing in the distance never ceased. It was as though something, or someone, was moving just beneath the surface, trailing me, following me. I couldn't escape it. My heart was still pounding, but now it wasn't from the physical exertion. It was from the creeping terror that had settled into my chest. I had seen it. I had seen the thing in the water. It was real. Whatever it was real. I reached the camp, but there was no sense of relief. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, heavier than it had been before. The tent that had once seemed like a refuge now looked more like a trap. Everything was still, too still, and the faint rustling of leaves in the distance was the only sound that dared break the suffocating quiet. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the thing from the lake trailing me, its twisted form creeping out of the water and onto the shore. But there was nothing. Only the forest. Only the quiet, empty trees. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like a pressure on the back of my neck, a sensation that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to slip up. I staggered into the tent, trying to force myself to breathe calmly, to make sense of what had just happened. But the images kept flashing through my mind, the face, the claws, the water, and each time they appeared, the horror grew sharper. I had to understand. I had to know what was happening here. I grabbed my phone, praying for some kind of signal, some connection to the outside world, anything that could pull me out of this nightmare. But of course, there was nothing. The screen flickered a few times before going black. No bars. No service. A sudden thought struck me. The lake. The water was doing this. It had to be. It wasn't just a reflection of my dreams, it was somehow manipulating them. But how? And why? As I stared at the black screen of my phone, the whispering started again. Soft at first, like the faintest brush of wind through trees, but then it grew clearer. Come back. We are waiting. The words felt like they were coming from inside my mind, wrapping around my thoughts, tightening with each syllable. I stood up, trembling, as my surroundings seemed to bend and warp before my eyes. The walls of the tent flickered, then dissolved into the darkness. For a brief moment, I was back at the lake, standing there, watching the water shimmer in the moonlight, its surface rippling unnaturally. And in the water, the reflection was there again. This time, it wasn't just smiling. It was grinning, its face stretching wider than should have been possible, its eyes gleaming with hunger. I gasped, stumbling back. The lake was calling me again. The reflection wasn't me anymore. It was something else entirely, something ancient and hungry, something that had been lying dormant beneath the surface, waiting for a chance to rise. I turned, desperate to get away, but the tent, the forest, they had all disappeared. I was back at the water's edge, unable to escape, unable to run. The reflection reached out of the water, its clawed fingers brushing against the surface, sending ripples out in all directions. It wanted me. It wanted me to step into the water, to surrender, to become a part of it. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I stumbled backward, my feet slipping on the wet ground. I had to get out of here. I had to get away from the lake before it dragged me in completely. But the path, the way back to my tent, it had disappeared. The water around me started to rise, creeping up my legs, its cold fingers wrapping around my ankles, pulling me down. My heart raced, panic flooding through me as I tried to free myself. But the more I struggled, the more the water seemed to pull me in. I looked up, my vision blurring as the reflection in the water grew closer, its grin widening. "It's too late," the voice whispered. "You're already part of it." I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the water, by the dark, by the thing that had been waiting beneath the surface for so long. And then, everything went black. I don't know how much time passed. I don't know how long I lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, the lake's cold fingers still holding me. When I finally opened my eyes again, I was back at the camp. The sun was higher in the sky now, but everything felt wrong. The air was heavier, more oppressive. The forest around me was still silent, unnervingly so. I sat up slowly, unsure of what had just happened. Had it all been a dream? A hallucination? No. The memory of the water, the reflection, was too vivid. It had been real. It had all been real. I got to my feet, my body aching as if I had been in the water for hours. But as I glanced around, something caught my eye. On the ground, right beside the tent, was something I hadn't seen before. It was a photograph, wet and crumpled, but still recognizable. I bent down, my hand shaking as I picked it up. It was a picture of me. A picture of me standing at the edge of the lake. But I wasn't alone. Behind me, standing in the water, was the figure, the twisted, contorted thing from my nightmare. And it was smiling. "We're waiting for you." The lake had claimed me. The photograph dropped from my trembling hands, fluttering to the ground as if the wind had caught it. But there was no wind. The air felt thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. My mind was spinning, fighting to make sense of what I had just seen. The photograph had been taken by me? Or had it been taken by the thing that had been haunting my dreams and my waking moments? The image of the twisted figure in the water lingered in my mind, its grotesque smile burned into my memory like a scar. I felt the overwhelming urge to leave, to run as far as possible from the lake, but my legs felt like lead. It was as though the place had become part of me, pulling me back, anchoring me in this nightmare. I staggered to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. The forest around me seemed to close in, its once familiar surroundings now foreign and hostile. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their dark shapes shifting unnaturally in my vision. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified, as if the very earth was trying to speak to me, to warn me. But I couldn't listen. I had to get away. With a sense of panic driving me, I turned toward the path that led away from the camp. My legs were unsteady, but I forced them to move. Each step felt heavier than the last, the pull of the lake still present in the pit of my stomach. It was there, in the back of my mind, its presence like a whisper that I couldn't escape. Come back. You belong here. The voice was faint at first, but it grew louder with each step I took, a constant murmur that crawled under my skin, wrapped itself around my thoughts. It was becoming harder to think, harder to concentrate. The pull of the lake was growing stronger, a magnetic force that seemed to draw me back toward the water's edge. My vision blurred again, the familiar path ahead of me warping, stretching. And then, like a flash, the lake was before me again. I froze. It was as though I had never left. The same rippling water. The same moonlight casting long shadows across the surface. And there, at the edge, was the figure. The thing that had followed me. It stood perfectly still, watching me with its wide, unblinking eyes, its grin impossibly wide, its features contorted in a way that defied reason. It was waiting for me. My legs refused to move. I could feel the water's cold fingers tugging at me once again, urging me to step closer. But I couldn't. I couldn't give in. Not this time. I turned and ran. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed through the trees, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the way the branches scraped against my skin, the way the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. My thoughts were fragmented, a jumbled mess of fear and confusion, but the one thing I knew for certain was that I had to escape. I wasn't going to let the lake claim me. I ran until my legs gave out, until my chest felt like it might burst from the exertion. When I finally collapsed, gasping for air, I looked around and realized I was no longer in the woods. The trees had disappeared. The forest had given way to a vast, open space. The lake. It was everywhere. The water stretched out as far as the eye could see, an endless expanse that rippled and shifted unnaturally, as though the surface were breathing. And I was standing in the middle of it, surrounded by the lake in every direction. There was no way out. The figure was standing at the center of the water now, no longer a distant reflection, but real, tangible. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything that could be called human. It was something far older, far darker. Its skin was slick, like the surface of the water, its limbs twisted and unnerving, too long, too thin. Its face was a mask of horror, a face that no one should ever see. And it was smiling. You cannot escape, the voice whispered, this time not in my mind, but from the thing itself, its voice gurgling like water sloshing in a drain. You are already here. You have always been here. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the realization. This was it. This was the end. There was no escaping it, no way to fight back. The lake had claimed me, and now I was part of it, lost in its dark depths, swallowed whole by its twisted reflection. But then, something strange happened. The water around me began to churn violently. The surface splashed and surged, as though something beneath was moving, something far larger and far more dangerous than the thing standing in front of me. And as it rose from the depths, I saw it. A massive, shadowy form, something ancient, something that made the figure look like a mere shadow in comparison. It was vast, incomprehensible, a silhouette of terror that filled the entire sky. And it was coming for me. In that moment, I knew that my fate had already been sealed. The lake had never been just a place. It was a doorway, a passage to something far worse than I could have imagined. And now, it was dragging me into its depths, pulling me into the eternal darkness where nothing could save me. I screamed, but the water swallowed the sound. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the shadow rising higher and higher, its eyes glowing with an ancient hunger. I had become part of the lake. And the lake, it saw all. The photograph dropped from my trembling hands, fluttering to the ground as if the wind had caught it. But there was no wind. The air felt thick, oppressive, almost suffocating. My mind was spinning, fighting to make sense of what I had just seen. The photograph had been taken by me? Or had it been taken by the thing that had been haunting my dreams and my waking moments? The image of the twisted figure in the water lingered in my mind, its grotesque smile burned into my memory like a scar. I felt the overwhelming urge to leave, to run as far as possible from the lake, but my legs felt like lead. It was as though the place had become part of me, pulling me back, anchoring me in this nightmare. I staggered to my feet, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow and rapid. The forest around me seemed to close in, its once familiar surroundings now foreign and hostile. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their dark shapes shifting unnaturally in my vision. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves seemed amplified, as if the very earth was trying to speak to me, to warn me. But I couldn't listen. I had to get away. With a sense of panic driving me, I turned toward the path that led away from the camp. My legs were unsteady, but I forced them to move. Each step felt heavier than the last, the pull of the lake still present in the pit of my stomach. It was there, in the back of my mind, its presence like a whisper that I couldn't escape. Come back. You belong here. The voice was faint at first, but it grew louder with each step I took. A constant murmur that crawled under my skin wrapped itself around my thoughts. It was becoming harder to think, harder to concentrate. The pull of the lake was growing stronger, a magnetic force that seemed to draw me back toward the water's edge. My vision blurred again, the familiar path ahead of me warping, stretching. And then, like a flash, the lake was before me again. I froze. It was as though I had never left. The same rippling water. The same moonlight casting long shadows across the surface. And there, at the edge, was the figure. The thing that had followed me. It stood perfectly still, watching me with its wide, unblinking eyes, its grin impossibly wide, its features contorted in a way that defied reason. It was waiting for me. My legs refused to move. I could feel the water's cold fingers tugging at me once again, urging me to step closer. But I couldn't. I couldn't give in. Not this time. I turned and ran. This time, I didn't hesitate. I pushed through the trees, crashing through the underbrush, ignoring the way the branches scraped against my skin, the way the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. My thoughts were fragmented, a jumbled mess of fear and confusion, but the one thing I knew for certain was that I had to escape. I wasn't going to let the lake claim me. I ran until my legs gave out, until my chest felt like it might burst from the exertion. When I finally collapsed, gasping for air, I looked around and realized I was no longer in the woods. The trees had disappeared. The forest had given way to a vast, open space. The lake. It was everywhere. The water stretched out as far as the eye could see, an endless expanse that rippled and shifted unnaturally, as though the surface were breathing. And I was standing in the middle of it, surrounded by the lake in every direction. There was no way out. The figure was standing at the center of the water now, no longer a distant reflection, but real, tangible. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything that could be called human. It was something far older, far darker. Its skin was slick, like the surface of the water, its limbs twisted and unnerving, too long, too thin. Its face was a mask of horror, a face that no one should ever see. And it was smiling. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered, this time not in my mind, but from the thing itself, its voice gurgling like water sloshing in a drain. "You are already here. You have always been here." I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the weight of the realization. This was it. This was the end. There was no escaping it, no way to fight back. The lake had claimed me, and now I was part of it, lost in its dark depths, swallowed whole by its twisted reflection. But then, something strange happened. The water around me began to churn violently. The surface splashed and surged, as though something beneath was moving, something far larger and far more dangerous than the thing standing in front of me. And as it rose from the depths, I saw it. A massive, shadowy form, something ancient, something that made the figure look like a mere shadow in comparison. It was vast, incomprehensible, a silhouette of terror that filled the entire sky. And it was coming for me. In that moment, I knew that my fate had already been sealed. The lake had never been just a place. It was a doorway, a passage to something far worse than I could have imagined. And now, it was dragging me into its depths, pulling me into the eternal darkness where nothing could save me. I screamed, but the water swallowed the sound. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the shadow rising higher and higher, its eyes glowing with an ancient hunger. I had become part of the lake. And the lake, it saw all. The sun was rising over the now empty camp, the stillness of the morning broken only by the faint ripples on the water's surface. There was no sign of the man who had come to the lake. No sign of anyone, save for the photograph that lay at the edge of the shore. It was a photograph of a man standing by the water. But there was no reflection. The water was still, and it was waiting. Always waiting. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.